Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of America's oldest and most baffling mysteries. A story so strange that if it happened today, you'd probably think it was some elaborate social media hoax orchestrated by a particularly creative influencer, with too much time and an unlimited special effects budget. Picture this, an entire town of 117 people just vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only empty houses, scattered belongings, and one cryptic word carved into wood. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no farewell notes, no dramatic Instagram stories documenting their final moments. Just gone, like they'd been plucked from existence by some cosmic magician having a particularly dramatic day. And honestly, if you'd been one of those colonists dealing with mosquitoes the size of small birds, humidity that could melt steel, limited Wi-Fi, well, zero Wi-Fi actually, and questionable hygiene standards that would make a medieval peasant wrinkle their nose, you probably wouldn't have lasted a week either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, from insomniacs in Tokyo to night shift workers in London to people who just can't sleep because they're wondering whether they remembered to lock the front door. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the windswept shores of what's now North Carolina's Outer Banks, where the Atlantic Ocean meets a chain of barrier islands that have witnessed more shipwrecks than a maritime insurance adjuster's nightmares. These islands have been claiming ships since before Europeans arrived, and they'll probably keep claiming them long after we're gone. Nature's way of reminding us that the ocean doesn't care about our navigation technology or our confidence. In GPS systems, the year is 1590, and you're accompanying John White, an English artist turned reluctant governor, as he returns to check on the colony he'd left behind 3 years earlier. The salt air carries that distinctive coastal scent, part seaweed, part possibility, part impending dread that something's gone terribly wrong, with just a hint of that fishy smell that makes you wonder if something died nearby, or if that's just how the ocean always smells when you're not on vacation. The journey to reach this moment has been harrowing enough to make a modern traveler grateful for delayed flights and overpriced airport food. White's ship has battled storms that would terrify experienced sailors, navigated waters where Spanish warships patrol like hungry sharks, and endured the kind of ocean crossing that makes passengers seasick just thinking about it. The crew has been subsisting on hardtack that could double as building material and water that tastes like it was filtered through a pirate's sock, while White himself has been consumed by guilt and anxiety about what he might find or not find on Roanoke Island. Picture White standing at the bow of that weathered vessel, his weathered hands gripping the salt-stained rope, his artist's eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the life he'd left behind. The man who once captured beauty on canvas now faced the terrifying possibility that everything he'd helped create had simply vanished. White's hands shake as he grips the ship's railing, not from the ocean spray, but from the growing certainty that the silence stretching across Roanoke Island isn't natural. Where there should be smoke curling from chimneys, voices calling across the settlement, children playing in the sandy streets, dogs barking at seabirds, and the general cacophony of human habitation, there's only an eerie quiet that makes your skin crawl. The kind of silence that horror movie directors spend fortunes trying to recreate with specialized sound equipment and carefully controlled environments. But here it's real, and it's been waiting 3 years for someone to break it. It's the silence of absence, not just quiet, but the complete void left when life simply stops existing in a place where it once thrived. As your boat approaches the shore, you can make out the wooden palisade that once protected the settlement, but something's off about its appearance. It looks abandoned isn't quite the right word. Abandoned suggests people left intentionally, packed their belongings, made conscious decisions about their departure. This looks like people simply stopped existing. The logs that once housed families, the workshops where craftsmen shaped tools, the gardens where colonists grew their meager crops. Everything sits exactly as it should, except for the complete absence of human life. It's like walking into a museum diorama where the mannequins have been removed but forgotten to take the eerie atmosphere with them, leaving visitors to wonder if the figures were ever there at all. The wooden structures show signs of weathering, but not destruction. There are no burn marks suggesting fires, no broken timbers indicating attacks, no evidence of the violent destruction you might expect if the settlement had been overrun by hostile forces. Instead, there's just the gradual decay that comes from abandonment. Weeds growing through floorboards, vines creeping up walls, small animals making homes in spaces once occupied by humans. It's nature's patient reclamation project proceeding at the steady pace of entropy that eventually claims all human constructions. You can almost hear the slow whisper of time itself, methodically erasing the traces of human ambition and hope. You notice how the silence seems to have weight, pressing down on the abandoned settlement like a physical presence. Even the usual coastal sounds, waves lapping against the shore, wind rustling through marsh grass, seabirds calling overhead, seem muted here, as if the island itself is holding its breath, waiting for someone to explain what happened to the people who once called this place home. When White finally steps onto the shore, his mind floods with memories of the day he left. He remembers faces, his daughter Eleanor, her husband Ananias Dare, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. He remembers the baby's cry, the laughter of children at play, the evening conversations of colonists planning their future in this new world. Now there's only wind and the rustle of dry leaves. Each step White takes along the familiar path feels heavy with dread. He knows he must search for clues, but part of him fears what he might find, or worse, what he might not find. The houses stand like silent sentinels, their empty windows like blind eyes staring out to sea. Inside, he finds evidence of life interrupted suddenly. Dishes still on tables, clothes still hanging on pegs, children's toys scattered across floors as if they'd just been dropped. But no people, no bones, no signs of struggle or violence. Just nothing. And then White sees it, the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. No sign of distress, no cross that they'd agreed to leave if forced to flee. Just the name of a nearby island, carved in rough but clear strokes. White's heart pounds. Croatoan, now Hatteras Island, was home to the Croatan people, a friendly Native American tribe the colonists had traded with. Could this be a clue, or just someone's final farewell? The word stares back at him like an accusation, or perhaps a promise. 5 letters that might hold the key to everything, or might mean absolutely nothing at all. White traces the carved letters with his finger, feeling the rough edges where someone had taken the time to chisel this message into the wood. Who had done this? His daughter, his son-in-law, a stranger. And why this word, this place, this final, cryptic message? As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the abandoned settlement, White stands among the empty houses and feels the weight of the mystery pressing down on his shoulders. 117 people had vanished, as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only questions and a single word carved into wood. The wind picks up, whistling through the empty structures, and for a moment, White thinks he hears something, else whispers perhaps, or the echo of voices long gone. But when he strains to listen, there's only the eternal sound of waves against the shore, and the creaking of wood slowly surrendering to time. And from that day to this, the mystery remains unsolved. The lost colony of Roanoke has become legend, a story told and retold through generations, each telling adding new layers of mystery and speculation. Maybe they moved to Croatoan, maybe they integrated with local tribes, maybe they died from disease or disaster, and nature erased all traces. Or maybe, on quiet nights like this, when the wind blows through those barrier islands and waves crash against the shore, you can still hear the faint echo of voices that vanished, still calling to each other across the space between history and legend. And perhaps that's the most magical thing about a mystery. It keeps the story alive, breathing, waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth hidden in the salt winds of time. Some say that on foggy mornings, when the mist rolls in from the Atlantic and wraps around those ancient trees, you might glimpse shadows moving through the settlement that shouldn't be there. Figures walking the paths, Children playing in yards that have been empty for over 4 centuries. But when you look closer, when you try to focus on these phantom residents of a lost world, they fade like morning dew, leaving you to wonder if you saw anything at all, or if the island itself is simply dreaming of the life it once held. The mystery of Roanoke isn't just about what happened to those 117 souls. It's about the spaces between knowing and not knowing, the places where history becomes legend, and legend whispers secrets that time itself has forgotten. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that some stories don't need endings to be complete. Sometimes the questions themselves are more beautiful than any answer could ever be. You follow White as he stumbles through the settlement gates, calling out names that echo uselessly against empty buildings. Eleanor, Ananias, Virginia. These aren't just random colonists he's seeking. Eleanor is his daughter. Ananias, his son-in-law, and little Virginia Dare is his granddaughter, the first English child born in America. Talk about family pressure. Imagine trying to explain to your relatives why you left them in a remote wilderness colony for 3 years. Sorry, had some supply issues, probably wouldn't cut it at the next family reunion. The houses stand like hollow teeth in an ancient skull, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had just stepped out for a quick errand and never returned. You peer into one dwelling and see a meal half prepared, tools laid out for work that was never finished, personal belongings scattered with the casual carelessness of people who expected to return. It's the kind of scene that makes you want to back away slowly while humming nervously. But White presses forward with the desperate determination of a man who refuses to accept what his eyes are telling him. Walking through the settlement, you notice how nature has already begun its patient reclamation project. Vines creep through doorways, weeds push up between floorboards, and small animals have claimed spaces once occupied by human families. 3 years might not sound like much, but in the humid Carolina climate, it's enough time for civilization's thin veneer to start peeling away like old paint. The wilderness here doesn't wait politely for permission to return. It simply flows back in like water, filling a broken dam. What strikes you most isn't what's missing, but what's been left behind so deliberately. Personal items that colonists would never abandon willingly lie scattered throughout the settlement. A child's wooden toy here, a woman's comb there, cooking pots still containing the remnants of what might have been someone's final meal. These aren't the belongings of people who packed up and moved on. They're the possessions of people who expected to be back before supper. White moves through his daughter's house with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb a crime scene, though no crime is apparent here. The absence itself is the mystery. Historians still debate whether the colonists left voluntarily, were forced to flee, or met some darker fate, but standing in this ghost town, you can feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down like humidity before a storm. The silence here doesn't just represent missing people. It represents missing answers, missing closure, missing explanations for one of history's most perplexing disappearances. But then White notices something that makes his heart skip like a stone on water. Carved into one of the wooden posts of the fort's entrance, barely visible beneath the creeping moss, are 5 letters, C-R-O-A-T. Not scrawled hastily or scratched in desperation, but carved with deliberate care, as if someone wanted to ensure the message would survive whatever came next. The letters are weathered but clear, like a whisper that somehow managed to outlast the storm. Now, here's where things get interesting in that, what the hell does that mean kind of way. Before White had left for England 3 years earlier, he'd established a code with the colonists. If they needed to relocate for any reason, they were to carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were in distress, they were to include a cross above the carving. White examines the letters carefully, running his weathered fingers along each groove. No cross, just Croat, which appears to be an abbreviated reference to Croatoan Island, about 50 miles south of their current location. You can almost see the gears turning in White's mind as he processes this discovery. On one hand, it's the first concrete clue he's found about where his people might have gone. On the other hand, it raises about a dozen new questions for every answer it provides. Why would they go to Croatoan? Were they invited, forced, Or did they flee there? In desperation? And most importantly, are they still alive? Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island, was inhabited by Native Americans who had generally maintained friendly relations with the English colonists. Their chief, Manteo, had actually traveled to England with earlier expeditions and had been baptized as a Christian. He'd been designated as the Lord of Roanoke and the Dasamongaponke tribe by Sir Walter Raleigh himself in one of those colonial arrangements that probably made more sense on paper in London than it did in the swamplands of North Carolina. White's crew, meanwhile, is getting increasingly nervous about lingering in this ghost town. Sailors are a superstitious bunch under the best of circumstances, and empty settlements with mysterious carvings don't exactly rank high on their list of comfortable vacation spots. They're muttering among themselves about weather patterns, supply levels, and the general advisability of staying anywhere that gives them the creeps this thoroughly. The urgency becomes more pressing when storm clouds begin gathering on the horizon like an invading army. The Atlantic coast of North Carolina isn't known for its gentle, predictable weather patterns. Hurricane season here doesn't just knock politely on your door, it kicks the whole thing down and rearranges your furniture without asking. White realizes that if they're going to investigate Croatoan Island, they need to move quickly before the weather traps them, or worse, sinks their ship entirely. As White prepares to leave Roanoke Island, he takes one last look around the settlement. That was supposed to be England's foothold in the New World. The irony isn't lost on him that this place meant to establish permanent English presence in America has instead become a monument to impermanence. The fort walls that were built to keep dangers out now seem to trap mysteries within. You watch as White carefully documents what he's found, sketching the layout of the abandoned settlement and making notes about the condition of the buildings. As an artist and cartographer, he understands the importance of recording details that might become crucial later. Every broken window, every scattered possession, every vine-covered doorway might hold a clue to understanding what happened to the 115 people who simply vanished from history. The weight of responsibility sits heavily on White's shoulders as he boards his ship. He's not just a concerned grandfather looking for his family, he's the last link between the outside world and one of history's greatest mysteries. The success or failure of his mission will determine whether the lost colony of Roanoke remains lost forever, or whether this particular chapter of American history gets the ending it deserves. As the ship pulls away from Roanoke Island, heading toward Croatoan, White stands at the stern watching the abandoned settlement shrink into the distance. The carved letters Croat represent his only hope, his only clue, his only connection to the people he left behind. In the growing twilight, the empty buildings look like tombstones marking the grave of England's first serious attempt at American colonization. The journey to Croatoan Island should take less than a day in good weather, but as any sailor will tell you, the definition of good weather off the Carolina coast is about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Dark clouds are massing on the horizon, and the wind is picking up in that ominous way that makes experienced mariners start checking their life preservers and wondering if they've made any enemies among the sea gods lately. Little does White know that this storm gathering around them will become more than just a weather inconvenience. It will become the final cruel twist in a story already filled with more mysteries than a locked-room murder novel. The distance between him and the answers he seeks is measured not just in miles, but in the growing fury of an Atlantic storm that seems determined to keep the secrets of the lost colony buried forever. You follow White as he stumbles through the settlement gates, calling out names that echo uselessly against empty buildings. Eleanor, Ananias, Virginia. These aren't just random colonists he's seeking. Eleanor is his daughter, Ananias his son-in-law, and little Virginia Dare is his granddaughter, the first English child born in America. Talk about family pressure. Imagine trying to explain to your relatives why you left them in a remote wilderness colony for 3 years. Sorry. Had some supply issues, probably wouldn't cut it at the next family reunion. The houses stand like hollow teeth in an ancient skull, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had just stepped out for a quick errand and never returned. You peer into one dwelling and see a meal half prepared, tools laid out for work that was never finished, personal belongings scattered with the casual carelessness of people who expected to return. It's the kind of scene that makes you want to back away slowly, while humming nervously. But White presses forward with the desperate determination of a man who refuses to accept what his eyes are telling him. Walking through the settlement, you notice how nature has already begun its patient reclamation project. Vines creep through doorways, weeds push up between floorboards, and small animals have claimed spaces once occupied by human families. 3 years might not sound like much, but in the humid Carolina climate, it's enough time for civilization's thin veneer to start peeling away like old paint. The wilderness here doesn't wait politely for permission to return. It simply flows back in like water, filling a broken dam. What strikes you most isn't what's missing, but what's been left behind so deliberately. Personal items that colonists would never abandon willingly lie scattered throughout the settlement. A child's wooden toy here, a woman's comb there, cooking pots still containing the remnants of what might have been someone's final meal. These aren't the belongings of people who packed up and moved on. They're the possessions of people who expected to be back before supper. White moves through his daughter's house with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb a crime scene, though no crime is apparent here. The absence itself is the mystery. Historians still debate whether the colonists left voluntarily, were forced to flee, or met some darker fate. But standing in this ghost town, you can feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down like humidity before a storm. The silence here doesn't just represent missing people, it represents missing answers, missing closure, missing explanations for one of history's most perplexing disappearances. Your attention is drawn to a wooden post near the settlement's entrance, where someone has carved a single word with deliberate, careful strokes. Croatoan. Not exactly the kind of message you'd expect to find helpful during a missing persons investigation, is it? It's like receiving a text that just says, "Gone fishing," when you're looking for your entire family. White stares at the carving with a mixture of hope and confusion, because this word might actually mean something significant, or it might be the 16th century equivalent of 404 error, colonists not found. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, about 50 miles south of Roanoke, where a group of friendly Native Americans lived. These weren't strangers to the English colonists. They'd established trading relationships and maintained relatively peaceful contact. Some historians suggest the carved message was meant as a forwarding address, a colonial "We've moved, please update your records" notification. Others wonder if it represents something more urgent, like "We've gone to Croatoan for help" or "Find us at Croatoan before it's too late." What makes this clue both tantalizing and frustrating is its complete lack of context. There's no additional information, no explanation, no helpful arrows pointing in specific directions. Just one word, carved with what appears to be careful. Deliberation, as if someone wanted to leave a trail but couldn't risk being too obvious about it. You run your fingers over the carved letters, feeling the rough edges where metal tools bit into wood, and wonder about the circumstances that led someone to choose this particular message. The absence of a Maltese cross above the word provides its own clue according to White's previous arrangements with the colonists. They had agreed that if forced to leave the settlement, they would carve their destination into a prominent tree or post, and if they were in distress, they would include the symbol of a Maltese cross above the message. The fact that no cross appears above Croatoan suggests, optimistically, that whatever happened, the colonists weren't in immediate danger when they left this message. But here's where the mystery deepens in that particularly maddening way that historical puzzles love to complicate themselves. White never made it to Croatoan Island to investigate further. Storms, supply issues, and the pressing needs of his ship's crew forced him to abandon his search and return to England. Imagine the frustration. You found what might be the only clue to your missing family's whereabouts, and circumstances prevent you from following it up. It's like getting a treasure map, but losing it before you can find the X that marks the spot. So the word Croatoan has lingered in historical mystery for over 4 centuries, carved into wood that has long since rotted away, but preserved in accounts that continue to puzzle researchers today. Some say it represents hope, a sign that the colonists found refuge with friendly Native Americans. Others see it as the beginning of a trail that went cold before anyone could follow it to its conclusion. The irony becomes even more bitter when you consider what White had just discovered. Here was a grandfather who had traveled thousands of miles across dangerous waters, who had waited 3 excruciating years for the chance to return, who had finally found what appeared to be a direct message from his missing family, and fate was about to snatch it away from him like a cruel magician's trick. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, transforming from troublesome to dangerous to potentially deadly with each passing hour. Standing there in the abandoned settlement, White faced an impossible choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could risk everything, his ship, his crew, his own survival, on the chance that following this single carved word might lead him to his family. Or he could make the rational, responsible decision to retreat while he still could, preserving the lives of his crew but potentially abandoning his loved ones forever. You can see the weight of this decision in every line of his weathered face as he stares at that carved word. Croatoan suddenly represents more than just a potential destination. It becomes a test of faith, a measure of hope, a cruel reminder that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones circumstances won't allow you to take. The howling wind seems to mock his indecision, growing stronger with each minute he hesitates. White's crew, already nervous about their ghostly surroundings, becomes increasingly agitated as the storm approaches. These are experienced sailors who recognize the signs of serious weather, and they're making it clear that their window for safe departure is closing fast. The ship's captain, caught between loyalty to his mission and responsibility for his men, begins to voice what everyone is thinking. They need to leave now, or they might not leave at all. The decision becomes even more agonizing when you consider the historical context. This wasn't just a family emergency. It was a matter of international importance. The fate of England's colonial ambitions in America hung in the balance. Queen Elizabeth herself had invested in this venture, and the information White might gather could determine whether England would abandon its American dreams or double down on its colonial efforts. But personal tragedy has a way of overshadowing political considerations. White wasn't thinking about queens or empires as he stood there with that carved message staring back at him. He was thinking about Eleanor, his daughter, who had trusted him enough to follow him to this wilderness. He was thinking about little Virginia Dare, his granddaughter, who had never known any world but this dangerous colonial frontier. He was thinking about Ananias, his son-in-law, who had risked everything on the promise of a better life in the New World. The storm that prevented White from reaching Croatoan Island wasn't just a weather event. It became a historical turning point that ensured the lost colony would remain lost. Had he been able to follow that carved clue, we might have a completely different understanding of early American history. Instead, we're left with one of the most enduring mysteries in the American story, a puzzle that has fascinated historians, archaeologists and mystery enthusiasts for over 4 centuries. As White finally makes the painful decision to abandon his search and return to his ship, you can feel the crushing weight of unfinished business settling on his shoulders. The carved word Croatoan will be the last communication he ever receives from his family, a message that promises answers but delivers only more questions. It's a reminder that history is often shaped not by the journeys we complete, but by the ones we're forced to abandon just when they might have led us to the truth. The ship's anchor is already being raised, as White takes one final look at the settlement that was supposed to be his family's new home. The carved message on the post stands as a monument to lost opportunities, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most important secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough or fortunate enough to follow where they lead. But on this day, in this storm, with these circumstances, even the bravest man must sometimes admit defeat. You can see the weight of guilt and desperation in John White as he searches frantically for any other signs of his family and fellow colonists. This isn't just any missing persons case. White was the colony's governor, and he'd left these 117 people to travel back to England for supplies in 1587. Imagine the heaviness in his chest, the way his hands must have trembled as he walked through the empty settlement. calling out names that would never be answered. What was supposed to be a quick supply run turned into a 3-year absence thanks to England's little conflict with Spain, also known as the Spanish Armada situation. Try explaining that delay to your missing daughter. Sorry, honey, got held up by international naval warfare. The irony is almost too painful to bear. A father's love interrupted by the machinations of empires, personal devotion sacrificed on the altar of national security. White wasn't just any colonial administrator. He was an artist, a man who saw beauty in the new world and tried to capture it in watercolors and sketches. His paintings of Native Americans and the natural landscape of Carolina reveal a sensitive soul, someone who understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary and fragile. This artistic temperament made his later suffering all the more acute. He could imagine with vivid detail all the terrible possibilities that might have befallen his loved ones. White's original plan had been beautifully simple and optimistically naive, the way most colonial ventures were. Sail back to England, load up on supplies, return within a year, and find the colony thriving and self-sufficient. Instead, he got caught up in England's maritime priorities, which at the time were focused on not letting Spain conquer them. Queen Elizabeth had other uses for ships and sailors than ferrying supplies to remote colonial experiments. It's like planning a weekend camping trip that turns into a 3-year absence because of work emergencies. Except the camping trip involved your entire extended family in a wilderness with no cell phone coverage. But this comparison barely scratches the surface of White's anguish. Every night during those 3 years, as he lay in his bed in England, he must have stared at the ceiling and wondered, are they still alive? Are they hungry, cold, afraid? The English court was a world of intrigue, ambition, and calculated risk. White found himself trapped in a system that valued grand strategy over individual suffering. While courtiers debated the merits of various military campaigns, White carried the faces of 117 people in his heart, real faces, with names and stories and hopes for the future. His daughter Eleanor, who had given birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, just days before his departure. His son-in-law Ananias, the craftsmen, farmers and dreamers who had trusted him to lead them to a better life. During those 3 years, White could only imagine what was happening to his colony. Were they starving? Had disease struck? Were they under attack? Had they simply given up and integrated with local populations? The uncertainty must have been torturous. Every month that passed made their situation more precarious and his chances of finding them alive more remote. Fathers worry when their adult children move to new cities with good infrastructure. Imagine how White felt, knowing his daughter was trying to raise America's first English baby in a settlement that barely qualified as permanent. The sleepless nights must have been endless. Picture him walking the streets of London, seeing mothers with their children, and feeling that sharp stab of loss and worry. Every baby's cry on the wind might have reminded him of his granddaughter Virginia, whose entire life had been spent in a world he could only imagine. The psychological torture of not knowing is something we can all understand on some level. When a loved one is late coming home, when a text goes unanswered, when silence stretches where communication should be, that gnawing anxiety that starts in your stomach and spreads through your entire being. White lived with that feeling for 3 years, amplified by the knowledge that an entire ocean separated him from the people he was meant to protect. The colony White had left behind wasn't exactly thriving when he departed. Supplies were running low. Tensions with some Native American groups were escalating, and the colonists were struggling with the basic challenges of establishing European-style civilization in an environment that had zero interest in accommodating their plans. They were like people trying to set up a suburban lifestyle in the middle of a nature preserve, ambitious but not necessarily practical. The Roanoke colonists were pioneers in the truest sense, attempting something that had never been successfully accomplished before, establishing a permanent English settlement in North America. They were farmers trying to grow familiar crops in unfamiliar soil, craftsmen working with tools designed for different purposes, parents raising children in a world without the safety nets they had known in England. The relationship with the local Croatoan people was complex, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense, always delicate. White himself had developed relationships with several Native American leaders, including Manteo, who had traveled to England and back. But diplomacy is fragile, and without White's presence to maintain those crucial relationships, the colonists were navigating dangerous waters with no experienced captain at the helm. When White finally returned in 1590, the guilt of his 3-year absence must have been overwhelming. These people had trusted him to return quickly with the supplies they needed to survive, and instead, he left them to face 3 years of Carolina weather, potential conflicts, food shortages, and all the other cheerful challenges of colonial life without support. Standing in the empty settlement, he wasn't just looking for missing colonists. He was confronting the possibility that his leadership failure had contributed to whatever fate had befallen them. The houses were still there, but they were empty shells like the hollow eyes of a skull. Personal belongings scattered and abandoned, gardens grown wild, the careful organization of colonial life dissolved back into wilderness. The only clue was a single word carved into a post: Croatoan. Not carved hastily, as if in desperation, but carefully, deliberately. Was it a message, a destination, a name? White knew the Croatoan people. They were allies, friends even. But storms prevented him from sailing to their island to investigate. Weather, that same cruel fate that had kept him from his family for 3 years, intervened once more to deny him answers. Historians debate whether White could have done anything differently, but the man himself never stopped searching for answers. He died in England still wondering what had happened to his family and the colony he'd been responsible for protecting. For it's a burden that would weigh on anyone. The knowledge that people you cared about vanished while waiting for help that came too late. The mystery of the lost colony has captured imaginations for centuries, inspiring novels, documentaries, and countless theories. But for John White, it wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a wound that never healed. Every sunset that painted the English sky red might have reminded him of Carolina sunsets. Every ship that sailed for the New World carried his hopes and his regrets. In his final years, White lived with the knowledge that somewhere in the vast wilderness of North America, the answer to his questions might still exist. Maybe his granddaughter Virginia had grown up among the Croatoan people, learning their language and customs. Maybe his daughter Eleanor had found love again and raised a family in a world that blended English and Native American traditions. Or maybe they had all perished in that first terrible winter after his departure, and the wind had long since scattered their bones. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think of John White standing on that beach in 1590, the waves lapping at his feet, the endless horizon stretching before him. His story is a reminder that love and loss are inextricably intertwined, that the most profound human experiences often exist in the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. The mystery of the lost colony endures because it speaks to something universal in the human experience, the fear of abandonment, the weight of responsibility, the ache of separation. White's story is a lullaby of loss, a gentle reminder that even in our darkest moments of uncertainty, love persists, memory endures, and hope, however fragile, continues to flicker like a candle in the wilderness night. Sleep well, knowing that some stories transcend their historical moment to become timeless meditations on what it means to be human, to love, and to carry the weight of care for others in an uncertain world. You're walking along paths that once connected the English settlement with nearby Native American communities, trying to understand relationships that were far more complex than most history textbooks suggest. The soft earth beneath your feet still holds the memory of countless footsteps, English boots and Native American moccasins, children running between worlds, traders carrying goods and stories from one community to another. The colonists weren't operating in isolation. They were part of an intricate web of tribal politics, trade relationships, and cultural exchanges that had been developing for decades before Roanoke. It's like being the new family in a neighborhood, where everyone else has established friendships, feuds, and unspoken agreements that you're expected to navigate without a guidebook. Imagine the delicate dance of these early interactions. English colonists trying to read facial expressions and gestures across a cultural divide. Native Americans attempting to understand the strange customs and motivations of these pale visitors who seemed to want things they couldn't quite articulate. The morning mist that still rises from the Carolina marshes might have witnessed these first tentative meetings. Picture Eleanor Dare, heavy with child, watching from her doorway as Native American women approach the settlement. Their arms full of corn and beans, their eyes curious but cautious. The universal language of motherhood might have bridged some gaps, a smile, a gesture toward her swollen belly, the shared understanding of bringing new life into an uncertain world. The Croatoan people, for whom that mysterious carved word was named, had generally maintained friendly relations with English visitors. They lived on what's now called Hatteras Island, where the wild horses still run free along endless beaches, and their chief, Manteo, had actually traveled to England with earlier expeditions. Imagine the culture shock, a Native American leader, experiencing 16th century London, then returning to explain indoor plumbing and horse-drawn carriages to his people. Picture Manteo walking through London's crowded streets, the smell of coal smoke and human waste overwhelming his senses, the noise of cartwheels on cobblestones, creating a symphony unlike anything in the New World. He would have seen the Thames choked with ships, the Tower of London looming like a stone mountain, the elaborate dresses of court ladies that required servants to help them move. What dreams did he carry back across the ocean? What nightmares? Manteo had been baptized as a Christian and remained allied with English interests, making the Croatoan settlement a logical refuge if the Roanoke colonists needed somewhere safe to relocate. In the quiet evening hours, when the day's work was done and families gathered around their fires, Manteo might have told stories of his London adventure. Children would have listened with wide eyes as he described buildings that reached toward the sky like mountains, horses larger than deer, and people who wore so many layers of clothing they could barely move. The friendship between Manteo and the English wasn't just political, it was personal. He had learned their language, adopted their religion, and risked his own standing among his people to maintain the alliance. This kind of cross-cultural friendship required tremendous courage on both sides. Imagine the loneliness Manteo might have felt, caught between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. But the political landscape wasn't uniformly welcoming. Other tribal groups had legitimate grievances against English colonists, who had a tendency to make promises they couldn't keep and demands they couldn't enforce. Earlier English expeditions had left behind a trail of misunderstandings, broken agreements, and occasional violence that the Roanoke colonists inherited whether they wanted it or not. It's like moving into a house where the previous tenants had ongoing feuds with all the neighbors. You're stuck dealing with conflicts you didn't create. The ghosts of these past conflicts haunted every interaction. Native American parents would have told their children stories of English treachery, just as English parents warned their children about savage attacks. Fear bred fear, suspicion bred suspicion, and the innocent newcomers to Roanoke found themselves inheriting a legacy of distrust they had never personally earned. The Socotan and Aquascogok peoples had particular reasons to distrust English settlers. Previous colonial ventures had resulted in the burning of Aquascogok village over a silver cup that was probably just misplaced, and the Socotan had seen their crops destroyed by English expeditions seeking food. These weren't ancient history by 1587. They were recent grievances that made some Native American groups view any English settlement as a potential threat worth eliminating. Imagine the conversations in Secatan longhouses during the winter months, elders recounting how English visitors had consumed their stored corn, leaving families to face hunger during the cold season. The violation wasn't just material, it was spiritual. Corn was sacred, carefully tended, blessed by generations of farmers who understood its rhythms and needs. To have strangers destroy a season's work was like watching someone burn down a cathedral. The burning of Aquascogok village over a missing silver cup reveals the tragic miscommunication that plagued these relationships. Perhaps a child had been playing with the shiny object, or it had been given as a gift, and the recipient didn't understand its value to the English. What should have been a minor misunderstanding escalated into violence because neither side fully understood the other's perspective. The smoke from that burning village would have been visible for miles, a dark message that carried across tribal territories. The English were not to be trusted. What makes the relationship dynamics even more complicated is that individual colonists had formed personal friendships and partnerships with Native Americans, while colonial leadership sometimes pursued policies that undermined those relationships. You might have English families who trusted their Native American neighbors completely, while colonial officials were planning military actions that would endanger everyone. It's like living in a community where your personal relationships contradict your government's foreign policy. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Picture an English craftsman who had learned to make tools the Native American way, finding that bone and stone could sometimes serve better than metal in the Carolina climate. His hands would have grown calloused from new techniques, his eyes trained to see materials in the forest that his European education had never taught him to notice. This man might have sat by evening fires with Native American artisans, sharing techniques and stories, building friendships that transcended cultural boundaries. Meanwhile, his wife might have learned Native American cooking methods, discovering how to process acorns into flour, how to preserve fish for the winter months, how to use local plants for medicine. These women, isolated from their European communities and families, would have found comfort and practical knowledge in the company of Native American mothers. The bonds formed over shared meals and child-rearing would have been deeply personal and treasured. But then colonial policy would intrude. Orders would come from leaders who saw only threats and opportunities, not the delicate web of relationships that individual colonists had carefully constructed. A military expedition might be planned against a tribe that included the friends and teachers who had become like family to some colonists. The politics of survival became personal, intimate, and heartbreaking. Children born in Roanoke would have known no other world. They would have played games that mixed English and Native American traditions, spoken words from both languages interchangeably, and seen cultural difference as natural rather than threatening. Virginia Dare, if she had lived, might have grown up more comfortable in moccasins than English shoes, more at home in the forest than in formal gardens. The mystery of what happened to the Roanoke colonists can't be solved without understanding these layered relationships. Did they flee to friendly communities? Were they attacked by hostile groups? Did they attempt to integrate with local populations, only to discover that cultural differences were harder to bridge than they'd expected? Historians continue to debate these possibilities, but standing in the Carolina wilderness, you can sense how precarious European settlements were when they depended on relationships they didn't fully understand with people whose trust they hadn't necessarily earned. The Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees has witnessed centuries of human drama. It has seen the quiet moments of cross-cultural friendship, Native American children teaching English children to fish, English women learning to weave baskets, men from both cultures working together to build shelters that combined European and Native American techniques. But it has also seen the moments of fear and violence, the misunderstandings that spiraled into conflict, the way good intentions could be destroyed by a single misinterpreted gesture or poorly chosen word. The moss sways in the evening breeze like a gentle reminder that all human relationships are fragile, requiring constant tending and careful nurturing to survive. Perhaps the Roanoke colonists simply scattered like seeds on the wind, each family or individual finding their own way to survive in a world that demanded adaptation. Some might have joined Croatoan communities, their English names gradually forgotten as they adopted new identities. Others might have traveled inland, seeking communities where their particular skills or knowledge would be valued. The carved word Croatoan becomes not just a clue, but a symbol of hope, evidence that in their final moments in the settlement, the colonists still believed in the possibility of refuge, still trusted in relationships that had been built across cultural divides. It speaks of friendship that transcended politics, of human connections that offered the promise of safety in a dangerous world. As the evening shadows lengthen across the Carolina landscape, you can almost hear the echoes of those long-ago conversations. English and Native American voices mixing in the twilight, planning for futures that would never come to pass, building friendships that time has rendered invisible but not meaningless. The mystery endures not because it cannot be solved, but because it reminds us how complex and beautiful and fragile human relationships have always been, especially when they must bridge the vast spaces between different ways of understanding the world. Your investigation takes a bizarre turn when you encounter one of history's most controversial archaeological claims, the Dare Stones, a series of carved rocks that allegedly tell the story of Eleanor Dare and the lost colonists. If authentic, these stones represent Eleanor's messages to her father, describing the colony's fate in her own words. If fake, they're one of the most elaborate historical hoaxes ever attempted. Either way, they're fascinating in that train wreck sort of way that makes you want to look closer, even when you know you probably shouldn't. The stones sit in museum storage now, silent and weathered, holding their secrets like ancient oracles, who have forgotten how to speak. Touch one of these carved surfaces, and you can almost feel the weight of human longing, not just Eleanor's supposed longing for rescue, but our own desperate desire to finally know what happened to those vanished souls. The rough texture of the rock tells a story, though perhaps not the one we hope to hear. The first stone was discovered in 1937 by tourists in North Carolina, carved with a message supposedly from Eleanor Dare to her father, John White. Picture. That moment, a family wandering through the Carolina woods, perhaps seeking a quiet picnic spot, when suddenly there it is, a weathered chunk of stone with crude letters spelling out words that seem to bridge 4 centuries of silence. The inscription describes attacks by Native Americans, the death of her husband Ananias, and her plea for her father to find her. It reads like a historical soap opera, dramatic, emotional, and conveniently providing answers to questions that had puzzled historians for centuries. The carved words spoke of loss and survival, of a young mother trying to protect her child in a wilderness that had swallowed her entire world. Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence, unto heaven 1591. Annie Englishman show, John White Gov Via, the stone declared, each word chiseled with what seemed like desperate urgency. The discovery made national headlines and sparked a treasure hunt for additional stones that supposedly told the complete story of the lost colonists' fate. Newspapers across the country carried the story, and suddenly everyone was paying attention to the mystery that had languished in historical obscurity for centuries. The stone offered something precious and rare, a voice from the past, speaking directly to us across the void of time. Imagine the excitement that rippled through academic circles and the general public alike. Here was Eleanor Dare herself, seemingly reaching across 4 centuries to finally answer the questions that had haunted her father's dying days. The stone promised to lift the veil of mystery that had shrouded Roanoke Island, to transform a historical puzzle into a human story with real names, real losses, real pain. Within a few years, dozens more stones surfaced, each carved with increasingly detailed accounts of Eleanor's life and adventures after leaving Roanoke. The stones described her journey inland, her relationships with various Native American tribes, the births and deaths of colonists, and even her eventual remarriage. It was like finding a 16th century blog written in stone, complete with personal drama and plot twists that would make reality TV producers weep with envy. The narrative that emerged from these stones was intoxicating in its completeness. Eleanor's story unfolded like a serialized novel. The desperate flight from Roanoke Island, the attacks by hostile tribes, the gradual integration with friendly Native American communities, the slow adaptation to a life that was neither fully English nor fully indigenous. Each new stone discovery added another chapter to her supposed saga, another piece to the puzzle that had tormented historians for generations. One stone described her marriage to a Native American chief, the cultural negotiations that must have surrounded such a union, the children born of 2 worlds. Another detailed the deaths of fellow colonists, their names carefully preserved in stone, as if Eleanor were maintaining a sacred memorial to her vanished community. The stones painted a picture of survival against impossible odds, of a young woman who had somehow found a way to thrive in circumstances that had destroyed so many others. The emotional resonance of these carved messages was overwhelming. Here was a mother writing to her father, a daughter preserving the memory of her lost husband, a survivor documenting the transformation of European colonists into something entirely new. The stones seemed to pulse with authentic grief, with the kind of intimate detail that only someone who had lived through such experiences could provide. But as more stones appeared, the story began to feel almost too perfect, too neatly resolved. Eleanor's narrative arc was so complete, so satisfying, that it began to resemble fiction more than the messy, incomplete reality of historical survival. Real life rarely provides such tidy conclusions, such thorough documentation of trauma and adaptation. The problem, of course, was that the stones were almost certainly fake. The carving style was inconsistent with 16th century techniques. The English language usage included phrases that didn't exist until later periods, and the convenient timing of their discovery, right when public interest in the lost colony was peaking, seemed suspiciously coincidental. It's like finding a diary allegedly written by someone in 1590 that includes references to ghosting people and throwing shade. Technically possible, but probably not authentic. Modern archaeological analysis revealed the deception with devastating clarity. The tool marks were wrong for the 16th century, the weathering patterns inconsistent with centuries of exposure, the linguistic patterns more suited to the 1930s than the 1590s. Each scientific test stripped away another layer of the illusion, revealing the stones not as Eleanor's desperate messages, but as someone else's elaborate fiction. The spelling and grammar mistakes that had initially seemed like authentic period errors turned out to be telling anachronisms. Phrases that sounded appropriately archaic to 1930s ears revealed themselves as linguistic combinations that would have been impossible in Eleanor's time. The very authenticity that had made the stones so compelling was actually evidence of their modern origin. Yet even as the scientific evidence mounted against them, the stones retained their emotional power. The carved words still spoke of loss and hope, of a mother's love transcending impossible circumstances. The fact that they were fake didn't diminish the very real human longings they represented. Our need for closure, for stories that make sense of senseless disappearances, for voices that can speak across the silence of history. But here's what makes the Dare Stones controversy genuinely interesting. They reveal how desperately people want answers to historical mysteries. The stones provided a narrative that satisfied our need for closure. Even if that narrative was fabricated, someone, whether driven by profit, attention, or genuine belief, invested enormous effort in creating an elaborate solution to the Roanoke mystery. Consider the psychology of the forger, spending countless hours carving fake messages into authentic, old stones. What drove such dedication to deception? Was it simple greed, hoping to profit from the discovery? Or was it something deeper, a genuine desire to give Eleanor Dare the voice she had been denied by history, to provide answers that real archaeology had failed to uncover? The hoax itself became part of the story, showing how unsolved historical puzzles attract both serious researchers and creative fabricators. The Dare Stones represent a kind of historical fan fiction, an attempt to complete a story that reality had left frustratingly unfinished. In their own way, they reveal as much about human nature as any authentic archaeological discovery might have. The stones also speak to our relationship with the past, our need to transform distant historical figures into people we can understand and empathize with. Eleanor Dare, as presented in the carved messages, wasn't just a colonial woman who disappeared. She was a relatable mother, wife, and survivor whose struggles we could imagine and whose pain we could feel. The Dare Stones also demonstrate the challenges of archaeological verification in an era before sophisticated dating techniques. In 1937, the tools available for authenticating historical artifacts were limited, and the stones' initial acceptance, by some scholars, shows how much we want to believe in convenient discoveries. Modern analysis has thoroughly debunked the stones' authenticity, but they continue to surface in discussions about Roanoke because they represent the most detailed account of the colonists' fate ever discovered, even if that account is completely fictional. The initial scholarly enthusiasm for the stones reveals something touching about the academic world's own longing for answers. Even trained historians and archaeologists wanted to believe that Eleanor Dare had somehow managed to leave a record of her experiences, that the silence of centuries could finally be broken by her own voice speaking from carved stone. The media. Coverage of the discoveries reflects the public's hunger for resolution to historical mysteries. Newspapers presented the stones as definitive solutions to the Roanoke puzzle, complete with detailed accounts of Eleanor's adventures and ultimate fate. The story had everything: romance, adventure, cultural conflict, survival against odds, and the satisfying conclusion that Americans have always craved for their origin stories. But the stone's ultimate exposure as forgeries carries its own melancholy beauty. They remind us that some silences cannot be filled, some mysteries cannot be solved, some voices from the past will remain forever beyond our reach. The real Eleanor Dare, if she survived at all, took her story with her into whatever fate awaited: the lost colonists. Her true voice, her authentic experience, her real suffering and adaptation remained locked in the past, inaccessible to our curiosity and longing. The fake stones lie now in storage, curious artifacts of 20th century wishful thinking rather than 16th century survival. They serve as monuments to human hope and human deception, to our endless desire to make the past speak to us in terms we can understand. In their silence, they whisper something profound about the nature of historical truth and the stories we tell ourselves when reality refuses to provide the endings we crave. As you drift towards sleep, consider the strange beauty of these false messengers, carved with love for a story that needed telling, even if that story was never quite true. They represent the best and worst of human nature: our compassion for the lost, our need for narrative closure, our willingness to create meaning where none exists, and our capacity for both profound hope and elaborate self-deception. You're exploring the possibility that the Roanoke colonists didn't mysteriously vanish, but instead made a practical decision to integrate with Native American communities for survival. This theory suggests that rather than being victims of some catastrophic event, the colonists became early examples of successful cultural adaptation, Europeans who recognized that their survival depended on abandoning colonial pretensions and embracing indigenous ways of life. It's like realizing that your suburban lifestyle isn't working in a rural environment, so you learn to farm from your neighbors instead of insisting on having groceries delivered. Picture Eleanor Dare in those final months before the colonies. Abandonment, her baby Virginia growing stronger each day, her husband Ananias working alongside Native American craftsmen to repair tools and build shelters better suited to the Carolina climate. The rigid boundaries between us and them would have begun to blur as survival became more important than maintaining European customs that served no practical purpose in this new world. Imagine the gradual transformation: English children learning Algonquian words for plants and animals that had no English names, Native American children discovering European games and songs, women from both cultures sharing recipes and medical knowledge while tending gardens that mixed European vegetables with indigenous crops. The colony wouldn't have disappeared overnight. It would have slowly transformed into something entirely new, a hybrid community that drew strength from both traditions. The evening fires would have told the story of this integration. Picture: families gathered around flames that warmed both English and Native American faces, stories being shared in languages that borrowed words from each other, creating new vocabularies for new ways of being. Children would have fallen asleep to lullabies that blended melodies their mothers remembered from across the ocean, with rhythms learned from their new neighbors. Archaeological evidence from the region supports the integration theory in subtle but compelling ways. Excavations at Native American sites from the late 16th century have uncovered European artifacts that suggest ongoing contact and trade rather than one-time raids or discoveries. Copper pieces, iron tools, and glass beads found in indigenous contexts indicate that European materials were being incorporated into Native American daily life through peaceful exchange rather than conflict. It's the difference between finding stolen goods and finding evidence of cultural blending. These artifacts tell stories of their own. Their piece of European copper, carefully worked into a Native American ornament, speaks of hands that learned new techniques, of artistic traditions that influenced each other across cultural boundaries. An iron nail, repurposed as a fishing hook, reveals practical innovation born from necessity and cross-cultural knowledge sharing. Glass beads found in Native American burial sites suggest that European trade goods weren't just economic commodities, they became personal treasures, valued enough to accompany their owners into the afterlife. The distribution patterns of these artifacts are particularly telling. Rather than being concentrated in obvious raid sites or conflict zones, they appear scattered throughout Native American communities in ways that suggest gradual integration rather than sudden acquisition. It's the difference between finding evidence of a home invasion and finding evidence that someone has been living peacefully in the neighborhood for years. Each artifact represents moments of connection. A European colonist demonstrating how to use an iron tool, a Native American craftsperson showing how to work copper in ways that European metalworking traditions had never considered. These weren't just material exchanges, they were knowledge transfers, relationship building, the slow construction of trust and mutual dependence that characterizes successful integration. The demographic reality of the Roanoke colony makes integration not just possible but probable from a survival standpoint. With only 117 colonists, including women and children, the settlement lacked the population needed for long-term sustainability through European methods. Intermarriage with Native American communities would have provided genetic diversity, local knowledge and protection that the isolated colony couldn't achieve on its own. Think of it as the ultimate arranged marriage program, except the arrangements were made by necessity rather than parents. Consider the practical mathematics of colonial survival. 117 people divided among perhaps 30 or 40 families with limited genetic diversity and even more limited knowledge of local conditions. A harsh winter, a failed harvest, or a disease outbreak could have devastated such a small population. Integration with established Native American communities would have multiplied their survival chances exponentially. The women of Roanoke would have been particularly aware of these calculations. Eleanor Dare, nursing her infant daughter, would have understood that Virginia's future depended not just on immediate survival, but on finding a community where she could grow up, find a partner, and have children of her own. In a settlement of 117 people, those options were severely limited. In integrated Native American communities, those options became abundant. Intermarriage wouldn't have been just about romance, it would have been about creating kinship networks that provided security, knowledge, and belonging. Native American societies had sophisticated systems for incorporating outsiders, time-tested methods for turning strangers into family members. The English colonists, struggling with isolation and vulnerability, would have found these networks incredibly appealing. Picture the wedding ceremonies that might have taken place in those final years. English brides wearing dresses modified with Native American beadwork, Native American grooms incorporating European elements into traditional ceremonies, communities coming together to celebrate unions that represented hope for the future, rather than mere political alliances. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations in the region have identified European markers that could date to the late 16th century, though the evidence remains inconclusive. Some families in the area have oral traditions claiming descent from English colonists who joined their ancestors, but separating genuine historical memory from later romanticization is nearly impossible after 4 centuries. It's like trying to verify family stories about your great-great-grandmother's mysterious past. Interesting, but not exactly courtroom-quality evidence. But what these genetic whispers lack in scientific certainty, they make up for in emotional resonance. Imagine discovering that your DNA carries traces of those lost colonists, that your family tree includes branches that stretch back to Eleanor Dare and her companions. The Roanoke mystery wouldn't be just historical curiosity, it would be personal. Heritage, family history written in genetic code. The oral traditions are particularly poignant. Picture grandmothers telling grandchildren stories about ancestors who came from across the Great Water, who brought new knowledge and new ways of doing things, who became part of the community through marriage and shared struggle. These stories might have been passed down for generations, carrying the memory of integration even when the specific details became blurred by time. Some families speak of ancestors with grey eyes or lighter hair, physical traits that stood out in Native American communities and became part of family lore. Others tell stories of European customs that persisted for generations. Certain cooking methods, crafting techniques, or religious practices that blended Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions. The integration theory also explains the Croatoan, carving as a farewell message rather than a distress signal. If the colonists had decided to join Manteo's people on what's now Hatteras Island, they might have left the carving to inform any future English visitors of their decision. It would be the colonial equivalent of leaving a forwarding address when you move, except the forwarding address involved adopting an entirely different way of life. Picture John White's men carefully carving those letters into the wooden post, knowing they were writing what might be their last message to the European world. The carving wasn't a cry for help. It was a statement of intentional departure, a declaration that they had found a better way to live than the struggling colonial experiment they were leaving behind. The word Croatoan becomes a symbol of transformation rather than tragedy. It represents the moment when European colonists chose adaptation over destruction, when they recognized that survival meant embracing change rather than clinging to familiar but failing methods. The carving marks not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter, written in a different language, lived according to different customs, but continuing the essential human narrative of finding home wherever love and acceptance can be found. What makes this theory particularly appealing is that it suggests the colonists made an intelligent adaptation to their circumstances rather than falling victim to mysterious forces beyond their control. Instead of being tragic figures who vanished into history, they might have been practical people who recognized that survival required cultural flexibility. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in those final weeks, families debating whether to cling to European ways or embrace the indigenous methods that had proven successful for thousands of years. Parents weighing their children's futures, wondering whether stubbornly maintaining English customs was worth risking starvation and death. Community leaders recognizing that pride could be fatal, that adaptation could mean not just survival, but prosperity. The decision to integrate wouldn't have been easy. It meant abandoning identities that had defined them for their entire lives, accepting that their children would grow up as something new, something that was neither fully English nor fully Native American, but beautifully, uniquely adapted to the world they actually inhabited, rather than the world they remembered or imagined. Historians continue to investigate this possibility through archaeological excavations, genetic studies, and analysis of Native American oral traditions, searching for evidence that the lost colonists weren't really lost, just successfully integrated into communities that knew how to thrive in the Carolina wilderness. Each new excavation season brings the possibility of discovery, a piece of pottery that shows European influence on Native American ceramics, a burial site that reveals mixed cultural practices, a tool that demonstrates the blending of technologies. The search continues not just for artifacts but for stories, for evidence that human adaptability triumphed over cultural rigidity. Modern researchers approach this work with respect for both European colonial history and Native American sovereignty, recognizing that the integration theory, if true, represents not the conquest of one culture by another, but the creation of something entirely new, communities that drew strength from multiple traditions to create ways of life that were more resilient than either could have achieved alone. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the beautiful possibility that the Roanoke colonists didn't disappear into mystery, but discovered something profound about human flexibility and the power of belonging. Their story might not be one of tragic loss, but of successful transformation, of people who chose love over fear, adaptation over destruction, and community over isolation. In your dreams, you might glimpse them, English children grown old as respected members of Native American communities, their grandchildren carrying forward the best of both worlds, their great-grandchildren so thoroughly integrated that their European ancestry becomes just one thread in the rich tapestry of American indigenous identity. The lost colony found not through discovery, but through belonging, not through rescue, but through the beautiful, courageous act of choosing to become something new. You're standing in the oppressive humidity of a Carolina summer, trying to imagine how environmental factors might have pushed the Roanoke colonists toward desperate decisions. The air hangs thick around you like an invisible blanket, making every breath feel labored, every movement require extra effort. Your clothes cling to your skin, and you can feel the moisture seeping into everything. Your belongings, your thoughts, your sense of what's possible in this strange, beautiful, merciless landscape. The climate here doesn't just challenge human comfort. It actively works against European agricultural techniques, building methods and survival strategies that the colonists brought from much cooler, drier conditions. It's like trying to run a New England farm in what's essentially a subtropical swamp that occasionally freezes and regularly floods. Picture Eleanor Dare, heavy with pregnancy in this suffocating heat, trying to tend a garden where the plants her grandmother had taught her to grow simply withered and died in the alien soil. Feel the weight of that humid air pressing down on the settlement as evening approaches, bringing not relief but mosquitoes that swarm in clouds thick enough to darken the twilight. The colonists would have huddled in their inadequate shelters, listening to the symphony of insects and night birds that spoke of a world they didn't understand, a world that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Tree ring studies from the region reveal that the late 16th century was marked by severe drought conditions, what scientists now call the Lost Colony Drought. Between 1587 and 1589, the area experienced some of the driest conditions in 8 centuries, making agriculture nearly impossible and reducing freshwater sources to dangerous levels. Imagine trying to establish a farming community during the worst drought in recorded history. It's like starting a car wash business in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Picture the colonists watching the sky each morning, searching for clouds that never came, praying for rain that fell somewhere else. The sun rose each day like a merciless eye, beating down on gardens that had already surrendered to dust, on wells that showed more earth than water, on faces that grew gaunt with worry and dehydration. Eleanor would have watched her infant daughters. Lips grow dry, would have felt the terrible mathematics of motherhood, calculating how long their water stores might last, how much she could spare for Virginia while still maintaining enough strength to nurse. The colonial women would have gathered at the dwindling well each morning, their conversations growing shorter as the water level dropped, their eyes holding the kind of fear that mothers carry when they realize they might not be able to protect their children from the fundamental needs of survival. The streams that had seemed so abundant when they first arrived, streams that sparkled in the sunlight and sang over smooth stones, gradually fell silent. First, they became trickles, then muddy pools, then cracked earth that spoke of water only in memory. The colonists would have followed these vanishing waterways like desperate pilgrims, walking farther and farther from the settlement in search of sources that could sustain them. Nights brought no respite from the drought's psychological weight. Lying in their stifling shelters, listening to the sound of wind moving through dry grass instead of the gentle babble of water, the colonists would have felt the landscape's rejection of their presence. Every withered plant, every empty water vessel, every day without rain was nature's way of saying, "You don't belong here, at least not in the way you're trying to belong." The colonists had arrived with European crops and farming techniques that were completely unsuited to Carolina's environmental challenges. Their wheat, barley, and peas needed consistent rainfall and soil conditions that simply didn't exist during the drought years. Meanwhile, they lacked the knowledge to cultivate indigenous crops like corn, beans, and squash that were better adapted to local conditions. It's the agricultural equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the gunfight lasted for years and involved everyone's survival. Picture Ananias Dare, Eleanor's husband, kneeling in the garden at dawn, his hands working soil that felt alien beneath his fingers. He would have planted seeds the way his father had taught him, the way his grandfather had learned from generations of English farmers. But this soil spoke a different language, responded to different rhythms, demanded knowledge that his bloodline had never needed to acquire. The wheat that should have grown tall and golden remained stunted and brown. The barley that should have provided grain for bread and brewing simply failed to thrive in the unfamiliar climate. Each failed crop was more than just lost food. It was a failure of identity, a severing of the connection between who the colonists had been and who they needed to become. Watch the colonial children, born into this struggle as they learned to be hungry in ways their parents had never imagined. European childhood had included certain assumptions about abundance, about the reliability of harvests, about parents' ability to provide. These Roanoke children learned different lessons, that the earth could refuse to cooperate, that familiar foods might never again fill their bellies, that survival might require abandoning everything their families had previously understood about living. The indigenous crops that grew wild around the settlement, corn that had adapted to drought conditions over centuries, beans that could flourish in poor soil, squash that stored well in humid conditions, remained mysterious to the colonists. They could see that these plants thrived where European crops failed, but the knowledge of how to cultivate them, how to process them, how to prepare them for storage, remained locked away in Native American communities that the colonists had managed to alienate through their cultural inflexibility. Storms presented another constant threat that European colonists were unprepared to handle. The Outer Banks position made them vulnerable to hurricanes that could devastate settlements built using European construction methods. Houses designed for English weather couldn't withstand Carolina storm surges, and colonists who had never experienced hurricane-force winds were like tourists trying to take selfies during a tornado, brave but not particularly well-informed about local hazards. Imagine the terror of the first hurricane to strike the settlement after John White's departure. The colonists would have had no warning system, no understanding of the storm's power, no knowledge of how to prepare for winds that could turn their carefully constructed homes into kindling. Picture families huddled together as their roofs began to leak, then sag, then collapse entirely under the weight of wind and rain. Eleanor, clutching baby Virginia to her chest, would have felt the flimsy walls of their shelter shaking like leaves in a cosmic wind. The storm wouldn't have been just weather, it would have been revelation, a violent demonstration of how little their European building techniques meant in this new world. Every loose board, every inadequate foundation, every architectural assumption, based on milder English storms, would have been tested and found wanting. The aftermath of such storms would have been devastatingly demoralizing. Crops destroyed just as they were beginning to show promise, buildings reduced to piles of soaked timber, precious supplies scattered across the landscape like the toys of careless giants. The colonists would have surveyed the damage and realized that their entire approach to settlement, their building methods, their agricultural techniques, their understanding of how to live safely in this environment was fundamentally flawed. The psychological impact of such destruction would have been profound. These weren't just material losses, but attacks on the colonists' sense of competence. Their belief that European knowledge and techniques could successfully transplant to any environment. Each storm that flattened their carefully constructed defenses was nature's way of teaching them humility they hadn't known they needed to learn. The isolation of Roanoke Island became particularly dangerous when environmental pressures mounted. During good times, the settlement's remote location provided protection from Spanish attacks and some Native American conflicts. But when drought, storms, or other environmental crises struck, the colonists couldn't simply pack up and move to more favorable locations the way indigenous peoples could. They were stuck on an island that offered limited resources during the worst possible environmental conditions. Picture the claustrophobic realization that must have settled over the colonists as their situation deteriorated. They were trapped. Native American communities could migrate seasonally, following game and favorable growing conditions, adjusting their locations to match environmental opportunities. But the English colonists had invested everything in permanent structures, in the European idea of fixed settlement that couldn't adapt to changing conditions. The water surrounding Roanoke Island which had once seemed like protective moats, began to feel like prison walls. Every failed crop, every depleted resource, every environmental challenge became magnified by their inability to simply leave for better conditions. They had committed themselves to making this particular patch of earthwork, even when that earth seemed determined to reject their efforts. Eleanor would have stood at the shore many evenings, holding Virginia and looking across the water toward the mainland, wondering if better opportunities existed just beyond their reach. The baby would have fussed in the humid air, uncomfortable in a climate that seemed designed to challenge every aspect of European infant care, while her mother contemplated the terrible possibility that their determination to stay put might be slowly killing them all. Food preservation presented additional challenges in the humid climate. European methods of food storage that worked well in cooler climates failed miserably in Carolina's heat and humidity. Salt pork spoiled, grain developed mold, and stored vegetables rotted faster than colonists could consume them. Combined with their agricultural failures, these preservation problems meant that the colonists were essentially living meal to meal during a period when their environment was providing very few meals. Imagine the heartbreak of watching carefully. Preserved food supplies, representing months of rationing and careful planning, simply rot in storage. The salt pork that should have lasted through winter would have developed a slimy coating that spoke of decay and danger. Grain that had been precious would have sprouted fuzzy mold that made it inedible and potentially poisonous. The colonial. Women would have fought a daily battle against entropy, trying to save what food they could, while watching their stored supplies surrender to humidity and heat. Every meal became a calculated risk. Eat the questionable preserved food and risk illness, or let it rot completely and accept hunger. These weren't academic choices, but life and death decisions made in stuffy storage rooms where the smell of decay battled against the desperate hope that something might still be salvageable. Children would have learned to associate certain smells with disappointment and fear. The sweet rot of spoiled vegetables, the sour tang of grain gone bad, the nauseating richness of meat that had turned in the heat. These sensory memories would have lasted longer than the food itself, creating associations between survival and revulsion that would have made eating itself a psychologically complex act. Historians now recognize that environmental factors may have made abandoning Roanoke not just sensible, but essential for survival. The colonists might have realized that their European lifestyle was fundamentally incompatible with their new environment during a period of exceptional environmental stress, forcing them to choose between cultural preservation and physical survival. In the end, the decision to leave Roanoke might not have been mysterious at all. It might have been the most rational choice available to people who had finally learned to listen to what their environment was trying to teach them. The carved word Croatoan becomes not a cry for help, but a declaration of wisdom, an acknowledgement that adaptation sometimes requires abandoning the familiar for the unknown. Picture the final days of the settlement, families packing what few possessions could be carried, children who had never known any other home preparing to leave the only place they remembered. The adults would have felt the weight of failure and the lightness of liberation simultaneously. Failure to make their European dreams work in this place. Liberation from the exhausting struggle against environmental forces that had proven stronger than their determination. As you drift towards sleep, consider the profound courage it must have taken to admit that their original plan wouldn't work, that survival required flexibility rather than stubbornness. The Roanoke colonists might have found their salvation not in persistence but in the wisdom to recognize when persistence becomes self-destruction, when holding on becomes a form of letting go of life itself. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll see them walking away from their failed settlement, not in defeat, but in the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from listening to the earth itself. They learned what the land was trying to teach them, that survival sometimes means surrendering, who you've been to become who you need to be. You're examining one of the darker theories about the Roanoke colony's disappearance, the possibility that Spanish forces, viewing any English settlement as a strategic threat, eliminated the colonists through military action. Spain had established extensive territorial claims throughout the Americas, and considered English colonial ventures to be illegal invasions of Spanish sovereignty. Here it's like having neighbors who consider your backyard barbecue to be a hostile invasion of their property rights. Except these neighbors had warships and professional soldiers. Picture the vast expanse of the Atlantic coastline in 1590, where morning mists rolled gently across pristine beaches and ancient forests whispered secrets to the wind. In this serene wilderness, the small English settlement of Roanoke existed as a fragile dream made manifest. Wooden houses clustered together like children seeking comfort, smoke curling peacefully from chimneys into the endless Carolina sky. The colonists went about their daily routines with the quiet determination of people building something precious from nothing, unaware that distant eyes watched their every movement with growing concern. Spanish intelligence networks were remarkably sophisticated for the 16th century, and they certainly knew about English colonial attempts along the North American coast. These networks stretched like invisible spiderwebs across the ocean, carrying whispered reports from port to port, from ship captain to colonial administrator, from merchant to military commander. Spanish documents from the period reference English settlements and include discussions about the need to eliminate them before they could establish permanent footholds. The language in these documents carries the cold efficiency of empire, not the heated rhetoric of personal hatred, but the calculated planning of those who view entire populations as chess pieces to be moved or removed. From Spain's perspective, allowing English colonies to survive would be like letting competing businesses set up shop in your exclusive territory, bad for long-term market control. The Spanish crown had invested enormous resources in establishing their American empire, sending countless ships across treacherous waters, losing thousands of lives to disease and warfare, pouring gold and silver back to fill royal coffers that funded further expansion. Every successful foreign settlement represented not just competition, but a fundamental challenge to the divine right that Spanish kings claimed over these vast new lands. The timing of the colonists' disappearance coincides with increased Spanish military activity in the region. Spanish ships regularly patrolled the Carolina coast, their dark hulls cutting through blue-green waters like predatory sharks, their crews scanning the shoreline for any sign of foreign intrusion. These weren't merchant vessels or exploration craft. They were purpose-built instruments of imperial policy, carrying soldiers trained in the harsh realities of colonial warfare, men who understood that mercy toward foreign colonists was viewed as weakness by their superiors back in Madrid. Spanish forces had already attacked and destroyed the earlier French settlement at Fort Caroline in Florida, demonstrating their willingness to use overwhelming force against European rivals. The attack on Fort Caroline had been swift and brutal. Soldiers, emerging from the pre-dawn darkness like avenging angels, their swords glinting in the first light of morning, their war cries echoing across the settlement as colonists stumbled from their beds into a nightmare of fire and steel. The Spanish commander had shown no hesitation in ordering the execution of prisoners, understanding that survivors might return to France with intelligence that could enable future colonial attempts. The Spanish approach to foreign colonies was generally straightforward: find them, destroy them, and eliminate any survivors who might rebuild or provide intelligence to future expeditions. It wasn't personal. It was imperial business policy, carried out with the same methodical efficiency that Spanish administrators applied to tax collection or ship construction. Spanish military manuals from the period contained detailed instructions for eliminating foreign settlements, treating such operations as routine maintenance of imperial boundaries rather than acts of extraordinary violence. What makes the Spanish theory particularly plausible is that it would explain the complete absence of physical evidence at the Roanoke site. A military attack followed by systematic destruction and body disposal would leave fewer traces than natural disasters, disease outbreaks, or integration with Native American communities. Professional soldiers know how to eliminate evidence of their activities, understanding that successful operations leave no witnesses and no physical proof that might complicate diplomatic relations or inspire revenge attacks. Spanish forces had both the motivation and capability to ensure that no English colony survived to challenge Spanish territorial claims. Their soldiers were veterans of European wars and American conquests, men hardened by years of campaign life, trained to follow orders without question and to complete missions regardless of personal feelings. They possessed advanced weaponry, disciplined formations, and most importantly the absolute certainty that their cause was just in the eyes of God and King. Imagine the scene if Spanish forces did indeed discover the Roanoke settlement. The quiet morning suddenly shattered by the appearance of armed men emerging from the forest like demons from a fever dream. The colonists, perhaps working in their gardens or teaching their children letters by the morning light, would have looked up to see steel helmets gleaming in the sun, to hear the foreign cadence of Spanish commands echoing across their peaceful community. There would have been moments of terrible confusion. Adults grabbing children, people running toward houses that offered no real protection, voices raised in prayer and panic as the reality of their situation became clear. However, Spanish records from the period don't include explicit references to attacking the Roanoke colony, which creates problems for this theory. Spanish bureaucracy was typically thorough about documenting military actions, especially successful ones that eliminated foreign threats. Spanish colonial administrators took pride in their record-keeping, understanding that detailed reports of successful operations would enhance their reputations with superiors and potentially lead to promotions or increased funding for future campaigns. The absence of Spanish accounts claiming credit for destroying the English settlement suggests either that Spain wasn't responsible or that the operation was conducted with unusual secrecy. Perhaps the attack was ordered by a local commander who exceeded his authority, or perhaps the operation was deliberately kept off official records to avoid diplomatic complications with England. Spanish policymakers were sophisticated enough to understand that some victories were better left unclaimed, particularly when official acknowledgement might provoke costly retaliation. Some historians propose a hybrid theory. Spanish forces may have attacked the colony, forcing survivors to flee and integrate with Native American communities for protection. This scenario paints a picture of absolute terror, followed by desperate flight. Colonists grabbing what few possessions they could carry, children crying as they stumbled through unfamiliar forests, adults making impossible choices about what to abandon and what might keep their families alive in the wilderness. This would combine the Spanish military threat with the integration theory, suggesting that the colonists didn't disappear mysteriously, but were driven from their settlement by military action and survived by adapting to indigenous ways of life. It's like having your house burned down by hostile neighbors, then moving in with friendly neighbors who help you start over with a completely different lifestyle. The survivors would have found themselves dependent on the kindness of Native American communities, learning new languages, new customs, new ways of understanding the world around them. Picture these English refugees, their European clothes gradually replaced by indigenous garments, their children learning to speak Native American languages with increasing fluency, their own English words slowly fading from daily use, except in whispered conversations between adults who remembered life before the attack. They would have carried the trauma of that terrible morning with them forever, but also the profound gratitude of people who had been saved from certain death by the compassion of strangers. The Spanish threat theory remains one of several possibilities that historians continue to investigate through archaeological research and analysis of Spanish colonial documents. Researchers spend quiet hours in archives, carefully examining centuries-old papers that crackle at the slightest touch, searching for casual mentions or coded references that might reveal the truth about what happened to those 115 English souls who vanished into the American wilderness. While it may not provide the complete answer to the Roanoke mystery, it reminds us that colonial settlements existed within complex international conflicts that could turn deadly without warning. These early colonists lived their daily lives against a backdrop of imperial competition that stretched across oceans and continents, their small community representing much larger forces that viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in the grand game of empire building. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander to that peaceful Carolina coast, where morning mists still roll gently across ancient beaches, where the wind still whispers through forests that hold their secrets. Closer, and where the mystery of Roanoke continues to invite our imagination into its quiet, enduring embrace. You're examining one of the darker theories about the Roanoke colony's disappearance, the possibility that Spanish forces, viewing any English settlement as a strategic threat, eliminated the colonists through military action. Spain had established extensive territorial claims throughout the Americas and considered English colonial ventures to be illegal invasions of Spanish sovereignty. It's like having neighbors who consider your backyard barbecue to be a hostile invasion of their property rights, except these neighbors had warships and professional soldiers. Picture the vast expanse of the Atlantic coastline in 1590, where morning mists rolled gently across pristine beaches and ancient forests whispered secrets to the wind. In this serene wilderness, the small English settlement of Roanoke existed as a fragile dream made manifest. Wooden houses clustered together, like children seeking comfort, smoke curling peacefully from chimneys into the endless Carolina sky. The colonists went about their daily routines with the quiet determination of people building something precious from nothing, unaware that distant eyes watched their every movement with growing concern. Spanish intelligence networks were remarkably sophisticated for the 16th century, and they certainly knew about English colonial attempts along the North American coast. These networks stretched like invisible spider webs across the ocean, carrying whispered reports from port to port, from ship captain to colonial administrator, from merchant to military commander. Spanish documents from the period reference English settlements and include discussions about the need to eliminate them before they could establish permanent footholds. The language in these documents carries the cold efficiency of empire, not the heated rhetoric of personal hatred, but the calculated planning of those who view entire populations as chess pieces to be moved or removed. From Spain's perspective, allowing English colonies to survive would be like letting competing businesses set up shop in your exclusive territory, bad for long-term market control. The Spanish crown had invested enormous resources in establishing their American empire, sending countless ships across treacherous waters, losing thousands of lives to disease and warfare, pouring gold and silver back to fill royal coffers that funded further expansion. Every successful foreign settlement represented not just competition, but a fundamental challenge to the divine right that Spanish kings claimed over these vast new lands. The timing of the colonists' disappearance coincides with increased Spanish military activity in the region. Spanish ships regularly patrolled the Carolina coast, their dark hulls cutting through blue-green waters like predatory sharks, their crews scanning the shoreline for any sign of foreign intrusion. These weren't merchant vessels or exploration craft, they were purpose-built instruments of imperial policy, carrying soldiers trained in the harsh realities of colonial warfare, men who understood that mercy toward foreign colonists was viewed as weakness by their superiors back in Madrid. Spanish forces had already attacked and destroyed the earlier French settlement at Fort Caroline in Florida, demonstrating their willingness to use overwhelming force against European rivals. The attack on Fort Caroline had been swift and brutal, soldiers emerging from the pre-dawn darkness like avenging angels, their swords glinting in the first light of morning, their war cries echoing across the settlement as colonists stumbled from their beds into a nightmare of fire and steel. The Spanish commander had shown no hesitation in ordering the execution of prisoners, understanding that survivors might return to France with intelligence that could enable future colonial attempts. The Spanish approach to foreign colonies was generally straightforward. Find them, destroy them, and eliminate any survivors who might rebuild or provide intelligence to future expeditions. It wasn't personal. It was imperial business policy, carried out with the same methodical efficiency that Spanish administrators applied to tax collection or ship construction. Spanish military manuals from the period contain detailed instructions for eliminating foreign settlements, treating such operations as routine maintenance of imperial boundaries rather than acts of extraordinary violence. What makes the Spanish theory particularly plausible is that it would explain the complete absence of physical evidence at the Roanoke site. A military attack followed by systematic destruction and body disposal would leave fewer traces than natural disasters, disease outbreaks, or integration with Native American communities. Professional soldiers know how to eliminate evidence of their activities, understanding that successful operations leave no witnesses and no physical proof that might complicate diplomatic relations or inspire revenge attacks. Spanish forces had both the motivation and capability to ensure that no English colony survived to challenge Spanish territorial claims. Their soldiers were veterans of European wars and American conquests, men hardened by years of campaign life, trained to follow orders without question and to complete missions regardless of personal feelings. They possessed advanced weaponry, disciplined formations, and most importantly, the absolute certainty that their cause was just in the eyes of God and King. Imagine the scene if Spanish forces did indeed discover the Roanoke settlement, the quiet morning suddenly shattered by the appearance of armed men emerging from the forest like demons from a fever dream. The colonists, perhaps working in their gardens or teaching their children letters by the morning light, would have looked up to see steel helmets gleaming in the sun, to hear the foreign cadence of Spanish commands echoing across their peaceful community. There would have been moments of terrible confusion, adults grabbing children, people running toward houses that offered no real protection, voices raised in prayer and panic as the reality of their situation became clear. However, Spanish records from the period don't include explicit references to attacking the Roanoke colony, which creates problems for this theory. Spanish bureaucracy was typically thorough about documenting military actions, especially successful ones that eliminated foreign threats. Spanish colonial administrators took pride in their record-keeping, understanding that detailed reports of successful operations would enhance their reputations with superiors and potentially lead to promotions or increased funding for future campaigns. The absence of Spanish accounts claiming credit for destroying the English settlement suggests either that Spain wasn't responsible or that the operation was conducted with unusual secrecy. Perhaps the attack was ordered by a local commander who exceeded his authority, or perhaps the operation was deliberately kept off official records to avoid diplomatic complications with England. Spanish policymakers were sophisticated enough to understand that some victories were better left unclaimed, particularly when official acknowledgement might provoke costly retaliation. Some historians propose a hybrid theory. Spanish forces may have attacked the colony, forcing survivors to flee and integrate with Native American communities for protection. This scenario paints a picture of absolute terror, followed by desperate flight, colonists grabbing what few possessions they could carry, children crying as they stumbled through unfamiliar forests, adults making impossible choices about what to abandon and what might keep their families alive in the wilderness. This would combine the Spanish military threat with the integration theory, suggesting that the colonists didn't disappear mysteriously, but were driven from their settlement by military action and survived by adapting to indigenous ways of life. It's like having your house burned down by hostile neighbors, then moving in with friendly neighbors who help you start over with a completely different lifestyle. The survivors would have found themselves dependent on the kindness of Native American communities, learning new languages, new customs, new ways of understanding the world around them. Picture these English refugees, their European clothes gradually replaced by indigenous garments, their children learning to speak Native American languages with increasing fluency, their own English words slowly fading from daily use except in whispered conversations between adults who remembered life before the attack. They would have carried the trauma of that terrible morning with them forever, but also the profound gratitude of people who had been saved from certain death by the compassion of strangers. The Spanish threat theory remains one of several possibilities that historians continue to investigate through archaeological research and analysis of Spanish colonial documents. Researchers spend quiet hours in archives, carefully examining centuries-old papers that crackle at the slightest touch, searching for casual mentions or coded references that might reveal the truth about what happened to those 115 English souls who vanished into the American wilderness. While it may not provide the complete answer to the Roanoke mystery, it reminds us that colonial settlements existed within complex international conflicts that could turn deadly without warning. These early colonists lived their daily lives against a backdrop of imperial competition that stretched across oceans and continents, their small community representing much larger forces that viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in the grand game of empire building. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander to that peaceful Carolina coast, where morning mists still roll gently across ancient beaches, where the wind still whispers through forests that hold their secrets close, and where the mystery of Roanoke continues to invite our imagination into its quiet, enduring embrace. You're following modern archaeologists as they employ cutting-edge technology to search for physical evidence of the lost colonists' fate. Ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, DNA analysis, and other scientific tools are finally being applied to a mystery that has frustrated researchers for centuries. It's like having a cold case detective with access to modern forensic techniques, investigating a crime scene that's been gathering dust for over 400 years. Except the crime scene covers several islands, and the evidence has been weathered by 4 centuries of hurricanes. Picture these dedicated researchers in the gentle morning light, their equipment humming quietly as electronic sensors probe the earth beneath their feet. They move with the patient precision of people who understand that history reveals its secrets slowly, one careful measurement at a time. The ground-penetrating radar sends invisible waves deep into the soil, creating ghostly images on computer screens that might reveal the foundation stones of long-vanished houses or the subtle depressions where wooden posts once stood. Each beep of a metal detector carries the possibility of discovery. Perhaps a pewter button that once fastened a colonist's coat, or a fragment of copper that gleamed in the hands of someone whose name has been lost to time. Recent excavations on Hatteras Island, the former location of the Croatoan settlement, have uncovered European artifacts that date to the late 16th century. Pieces of iron, copper, and pottery that match materials known to have been brought by the Roanoke colonists suggest that at least some European presence existed in the Croatoan community after 1587. These fragments emerge from the earth like whispered messages from the past, a piece of rusted metal that might have once been part of a cooking pot where English and Native American families shared meals together, or a shard of pottery that held water drawn from wells dug by hands that spoke both English and Algonquian. It's not definitive proof that the lost colonists integrated with the Croatoan people, but it's the kind of evidence that makes archaeologists do little happy dances when they think no one is watching. These moments of discovery carry profound emotional weight. Researchers who have spent years sifting through sand and soil suddenly holding objects that connect them directly to people who lived and loved and struggled in this same landscape 4 centuries ago. The artifacts speak of daily life, of practical needs met and human connections forged across cultural boundaries that seemed impossible to bridge. Archaeological work at the original Roanoke settlement site has been complicated by centuries of natural changes to the landscape. Rising sea levels, storm damage, and normal geological processes have altered the island's topography significantly since the 16th century. The gentle, persistent action of wind and water has reshaped the very ground where the colonists once walked, erasing roads they might have traveled, covering foundations they built with patient hope, transforming familiar landmarks into something entirely different. Parts of the original settlement may now be underwater, which would explain why so little physical evidence has been found at the obvious locations. Imagine the poignant irony. The very houses where colonists once sought shelter from Atlantic storms may now rest beneath those same waters, their timbers becoming homes for fish rather than families, their hearths cold beneath the endless tides. It's challenging, even with modern underwater archaeology techniques, to retrieve memories from the ocean floor, where 4 centuries of salt water have claimed whatever wooden structures might have survived Spanish attacks or natural disasters. The underwater archaeology teams work with dreams of discovery floating through their minds as they descend into the dark waters off the Carolina coast. Their diving lights cut through the murky depths like tiny suns, illuminating sandy bottoms where fragments of the past might rest undisturbed. Each dive carries the possibility of finding something extraordinary, perhaps the remains of a colonist's dwelling or personal belongings that were abandoned in haste when the settlement was evacuated or attacked. DNA studies of Native American populations in the region have produced intriguing but inconclusive results. Some families show European genetic markers that could date to the colonial period, but distinguishing between 16th century integration and later European contact is nearly impossible using current genetic analysis methods. The DNA tells stories, written in a language that science is still learning to read. Microscopic narratives of human connection that span generations, carrying within them the possibility that English colonists and Native American families found ways to build new lives together, despite the vast cultural differences that separated their original worlds. It's like trying to determine whether someone's great-great-grandmother was from England or just really enjoyed spending time with English sailors. The genetic evidence is there, but the timeline remains fuzzy. These genetic mysteries carry profound human meaning, suggesting that love and partnership may have blossomed in circumstances that official histories never recorded, that children were born who carried both English and Native American heritage in their blood, living bridges between two worlds that official policies tried to keep separate. The First Colony Foundation has been conducting systematic archaeological surveys throughout the region, using historical documents to identify potential locations where colonists might have relocated. Their work has uncovered evidence of European presence at several sites that were previously unexplored, suggesting that the colonists may have established multiple settlements or camps rather than disappearing entirely. These discoveries paint a picture of movement and adaptation rather than sudden vanishing. Perhaps small groups of colonists, driven by various circumstances, created a network of temporary settlements as they searched for sustainable ways to survive in their new homeland. It's like discovering that missing people didn't vanish, but instead scattered to several different locations, making the search much more complex, but potentially more hopeful. Each new site tells part of a larger story. A cooking hearth here, fragments of European pottery there, traces of metalworking that suggest people were attempting to maintain familiar technologies while adapting to new environments. The evidence speaks of resilience and creativity, of people who refused to simply disappear, but instead found ways to persist, even when their original plans failed catastrophically. Advanced analysis of the Croatoan carving site has revealed additional markings that were previously invisible or unrecognized. While these don't provide dramatic new clues, they suggest that the carved message was part of a more extensive communication system that has been partially obscured by centuries of weathering. Digital enhancement techniques reveal ghost images of letters and symbols that earlier investigators, working with only their eyes and simple tools, could never have detected. Historians are now using digital enhancement techniques to search for other carvings or marks that might have been missed by earlier investigators who lacked modern imaging technology. Computer programs can detect variations in wood grain and weathering patterns that might indicate the presence of carved letters or symbols, bringing new possibilities to surfaces that have been examined countless times over the centuries. Each enhanced image carries the potential for revelation, perhaps additional words that would clarify the meaning of Croatoan, or entirely new messages carved by desperate hands trying to communicate across time. The combination of multiple archaeological approaches is gradually building a more complete picture of what might have happened to the Roanoke colonists, though the mystery remains unsolved. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle, but the complete picture continues to elude researchers who are working to separate evidence from speculation in one of America's oldest unsolved cases. The work continues with the patient persistence of people who understand that some truths take centuries to reveal themselves, that the past speaks in whispers that require careful listening and endless dedication to hear clearly. As sleep approaches, let your mind rest with these dedicated researchers working in the quiet hours of dawn and dusk, their careful hands sifting through centuries of accumulated earthen memory, their electronic instruments singing soft songs of discovery and possibility. In their patient work lies the hope that someday the mystery of Roanoke will yield its secrets to those who seek the truth with sufficient care and devotion, bringing peace to a story that has waited 400 years to find its proper ending. You're exploring other mysterious disappearances throughout American history, that echo the Roanoke mystery. Because apparently, entire communities vanishing without explanation is more common than anyone would prefer. These cases drift through the pages of history like morning mist, settling softly into the landscape of our understanding, each one a whispered story of human resilience meeting impossible circumstances. The pattern emerges slowly, like stars appearing in the twilight sky, suggesting that the lost colony might not be unique, but rather part of a gentle rhythm of settlements that failed in ways that left few traces for historians to analyze. It's like discovering that your weird neighbor isn't the only person who collects vintage lawn gnomes. Suddenly the behavior seems less mysterious and more part of a disturbing trend, though perhaps one that speaks to something deeper about human nature and our need to create meaning in an uncertain world. The stories unfold like pages turning in an old book, each disappearance carrying its own weight of sorrow and wonder. As you settle into these tales, you can almost feel the weight of history settling around you, like a comfortable blanket, each mystery a lullaby sung by time itself. The rhythm of these disappearances creates a pattern as old as human settlement, as predictable as the tides that wash away footprints on distant shores. The Jamestown colony, established just 20 years after Roanoke, experienced its own version of mass disappearance during the starving time winter of 1609-1610, when the very air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of tragedy. The colonists moved through those dark months like shadows cast by a dying fire, their hopes growing dimmer with each passing day. While some colonists survived to tell the tale, their voices carrying across the centuries like wind through empty rooms, the majority of the settlement's population simply vanished, leaving behind only echoes and questions that still whisper through the Virginia woods. The survivors spoke in hushed tones of evidence of cannibalism and complete social breakdown, their words heavy with the weight of unimaginable choices made in unimaginable circumstances. Unlike Roanoke, Jamestown's disappearances were documented by survivors, but the specific fates of individual colonists remain unknown, like names written in sand before the tide comes in. It's like having witnesses to a disaster, but still not knowing exactly what happened to most of the victims, their stories dissolving into the gentle haze of imperfect memory and incomplete understanding. The winter of 1609 to 1610 settled over Jamestown, like a heavy quilt, muffling sound and hope alike. The colonists huddled in their wooden shelters, watching their supplies dwindle like candles burning down to nothing. Some nights, families would gather around what little fire they could maintain, sharing stories of home across the vast Atlantic, their voices growing softer as the weeks passed. Children fell asleep to the sound of their parents' worried whispers, dreams carrying them back to English meadows and warm hearths that existed now only in memory. When spring finally arrived, it found a settlement transformed, its population scattered to the winds of history, leaving behind only fragments of lives once lived with hope and determination. The Lost Franklin expedition of 1845 represents another case of well-documented people who vanished completely in the Arctic while searching for the Northwest Passage, their ships becoming frozen monuments to human ambition in the endless white silence of the polar regions. The ice held their vessels like a mother's embrace, protective yet fatal, preserving their final moments in crystal clarity while obscuring their ultimate fate. Despite extensive search efforts that stretched across decades and modern archaeological investigations that continue to this day, the specific circumstances of how 129 experienced explorers died remain largely mysterious, their story drifting through the Arctic wind like snow that never settles. Like the Roanoke colonists, they left behind scattered artifacts and tantalizing clues, buttons and bones, ship's timbers and personal effects, but no clear explanation of their final fate, only the vast silence of the Arctic speaking in a language we struggle to understand. The Franklin expedition members moved through their final months like figures in a dream, their world reduced to white horizons and the creak of icebound ships. They maintained their naval discipline even as hope froze around them, writing careful entries in logbooks that would later be found by searchers, the ink still legible, but the men who wrote those words long since returned to the elements. Some nights they might have gathered in the ship's hold, sharing rations and stories, their breath visible in the cold air as they spoke of families waiting back home. Their disappearance speaks to the profound loneliness of exploration, the way distance can transform ordinary people into legends, their absence more powerful than their presence ever was. Closer to home, several American frontier settlements experienced unexplained abandonments during the 18th and 19th centuries, their stories settling into the American landscape, like morning dew that evaporates before anyone notices. Towns that had been established and thriving would suddenly be found empty, with houses, businesses, and personal belongings left behind, as if residents had simply walked away from their lives, leaving their morning coffee still warm on wooden tables. Unlike modern ghost towns that were abandoned due to economic changes, these settlements were deserted, under circumstances that their contemporaries found baffling, like waking from a dream only to find that everyone else is still sleeping. These frontier communities had been carved from wilderness, with the same determination that built cathedrals, each cabin and storefront representing countless hours of labor and hope. Families had planted gardens and built schools, established routines that spoke of permanence and faith in the future. Children had played in dusty streets, while their parents worked to build something lasting from the raw materials of the American frontier. Yet somehow these carefully constructed lives dissolved like sugar in rain, leaving behind only empty buildings and questions that echo through the years like wind through abandoned doorways. The pattern of mysterious disappearances often involves communities that were isolated, under stress from environmental or social pressures, and dependent on external support that failed to arrive when needed, like lighthouses whose beacon goes dark just when ships need guidance most. Roanoke fits this pattern perfectly. Isolated island location, stressed by drought and supply shortages, dependent on John White's supply mission that was delayed for 3 years by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The colonists waited, through seasons that must have felt like lifetimes, watching the horizon for sails that didn't come, their hope gradually transforming into something more complex and harder to define. It suggests that the colonists' fate, while still unknown, probably followed understandable human responses to desperate circumstances, rather than supernatural or completely mysterious causes, their disappearance as natural as leaves falling from trees when autumn arrives. The waiting must have been the hardest part for the Roanoke colonists, those long months when every dawn brought the possibility of rescue and every sunset brought another day of uncertainty. They would have developed rituals to mark time's passage, small ceremonies that gave structure to days that might otherwise have dissolved into anxiety and fear. Mothers would have sung lullabies to children who asked when the ships would come, their voices carrying across the settlement like prayers whispered into the wind. The community would have drawn together in the face of uncertainty, sharing meals and stories, their bonds growing stronger even as their situation grew more desperate. What makes these disappearances particularly frustrating for historians is that they often occurred during periods when record-keeping was inconsistent and communication systems were unreliable, like trying to piece together a conversation when half the words have been carried away by the wind. People could vanish for perfectly logical reasons: disease, starvation, conflicts, or integration with other communities. But if no one survived to document what happened, the disappearance would seem mysterious to later investigators, their absence echoing through time like footsteps in an empty house. It's like trying to solve crimes where all the witnesses have also disappeared, leaving only physical evidence that can be interpreted in multiple ways, each theory as valid as the last, creating a gentle uncertainty that rocks like a cradle. In the dim light of historical understanding, the silence left by these vanished communities speaks its own language, one that historians learn to read like poetry written in disappearing ink. Each abandoned settlement tells a story of human ambition, meeting natural forces, of dreams that grew too far from their roots, of people who dared to plant their hopes in uncertain soil. The artifacts they left behind, tools and toys, letters and buttons, carry the weight of interrupted lives, conversations that ended mid-sentence, plans that dissolved like morning mist when the sun grows too warm. The comparative analysis of mysterious disappearances suggests that Roanoke's lost colonists probably met a fate that would have been comprehensible to their contemporaries, even if the specific details remain unknown to modern historians, like a familiar melody played too softly to make out the individual notes. Their disappearance seems mysterious, primarily because we lack documentation, not because their fate was actually supernatural or inexplicable, the mystery existing more in her desire to know than in any inherent impossibility of understanding. They simply joined the great river of human experience, their individual stories flowing into the larger current of history, their disappearance as natural as stars fading when dawn arrives. As you drift towards sleep, you can almost hear the whispered conversations of all these vanished communities, their voices blending into a gentle chorus that speaks of human resilience and the quiet acceptance that comes when people realize they must face their circumstances with whatever courage they can muster. Their stories become a lullaby sung by time itself, reminding us that disappearance is just another form of transformation, and that even when people vanish from the pages of history, they leave behind something more enduring than documentation. They leave behind the memory of human hope, persistent as wildflowers growing through cracks in abandoned foundations, beautiful in its quiet determination to continue existing, even when no one is watching. You're diving into how the lost colony has become embedded in American cultural mythology, transforming from a historical puzzle into a foundational legend that says as much about American identity as it does about 16th century colonial failures. The way stories sometimes grow larger than their origins, becoming something more expansive and meaningful than the events that first inspired them. The story has been retold, reimagined and reinvented countless times, each version reflecting the concerns and aspirations of the era that produced it, like a song passed down through generations, where each singer adds their own melody while keeping the essential rhythm intact. It's like watching the same story told by different generations, each one adding their own cultural anxieties and romantic notions until the original facts are buried under layers of interpretation, soft as flower petals pressed between the pages of old books, each layer adding fragrance and meaning to the whole. The transformation of historical fact into cultural legend happens as naturally as seasons changing, with each retelling adding warmth and color to what might otherwise remain cold historical data. Like firelight flickering against cabin walls, each new version of the story casts different shadows, illuminating aspects that previous tellings might have left in darkness. The mystery becomes a living thing, breathing with the rhythms of American cultural life, growing stronger and more complex with each generation that discovers it anew. The lost colony entered American popular culture during the 19th century, when the young nation was developing its own historical narratives, separate from European traditions, like a child learning to tell its own stories rather than simply repeating tales learned from parents. Writers and historians presented the Roanoke mystery as uniquely American, a story of brave pioneers facing unknown challenges in the New World, their courage shining like lanterns in the darkness of uncertainty. The colonists were portrayed as heroic figures whose sacrifice helped establish English presence in America. Even though their settlement actually failed completely, their failure transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, like wildflowers growing from ruins. It's the historical equivalent of turning a business failure into an inspiring story about entrepreneurial spirit, the way memory has of polishing rough stones until they gleam with significance. During those formative decades of American identity, the lost colony story provided something essential that a young nation needed, a founding myth that spoke to the courage required to leave everything familiar behind and venture into the unknown. The colonists became symbols of the pioneer spirit that would later drive westward expansion. Their disappearance not a tragedy, but a transformation, like stars that burn so brightly they become part of the eternal sky. Writers would sit by candlelight, crafting versions of the story that emphasized the nobility of the attempt rather than the failure of the outcome, understanding instinctively that nations need heroes more than they need accurate historical records. Paul Green's outdoor drama The Lost Colony, which has been performed annually since 1937, crystallized many popular perceptions about the colonists' fate the theatrical production becoming a ritual as regular as summer itself, drawing audiences into a shared dream of what America's beginnings might have been. The production presents a romanticized version of colonial life that emphasizes courage, love, and tragic sacrifice, while glossing over the more mundane possibilities like starvation, disease, or poor planning, creating a vision of the past that glows with the warm light of idealized memory. Millions of visitors have experienced this theatrical interpretation, which has probably influenced public understanding of the Roanoke mystery more than any academic research, their hearts stirred by dramatic speeches and stirring music that transforms historical uncertainty into emotional certainty. The outdoor amphitheater where the drama unfolds becomes a sacred space each summer evening, with audiences gathering as the sun sets over Roanoke Sound, the same waters that once carried the hopes of actual colonists. Families settle onto wooden benches, children leaning against their parents as the story unfolds on stage, the boundary between history and imagination dissolving like mist in morning sunlight. The actors' voices carry across the water, mixing with the sound of waves and wind, creating an experience that feels more like shared memory than performed entertainment. Night after night, season after season, the story is retold with such conviction that it begins to feel more real than the historical uncertainty it's meant to represent. The story has been adapted into numerous novels, children's books, and television programs, each version adding new elements that have become part of the popular mythology. Like streams flowing into a river, each contribution making the whole larger and more complex. Some versions emphasize supernatural explanations, weaving threads of magic into the historical fabric, suggesting that the colonists didn't simply disappear, but were transformed into something beyond ordinary human understanding. Others focus on romantic relationships between colonists and Native Americans, love stories that bridge cultural divides, and offer hope that differences can be overcome through understanding and affection. Still others present the disappearance as a tragic consequence of English-Spanish conflicts, political tensions that swept away innocent people like leaves caught in an unexpected storm. The accumulation of fictional interpretations has created a cultural understanding of the lost colony that bears only passing resemblance to historical evidence, but carries emotional truth that resonates across centuries. Each fictional adaptation becomes a lens through which Americans can examine their own experiences of loss, displacement, and hope. Children reading picture books about the lost colony absorb lessons about courage and perseverance, while adults watching television documentaries find metaphors for their own feelings of being lost in uncertain times. The story becomes a mirror that reflects whatever the reader or viewer needs to see, offering comfort to those who feel abandoned and inspiration to those facing seemingly impossible challenges. Modern tourism has transformed Roanoke Island into a destination where visitors can experience manufactured mystery, the island itself becoming a stage where the boundary between history and entertainment dissolves like sugar in warm tea. Museums, tours, and educational programs present various theories about the colonists' fate, while acknowledging that the truth remains unknown, creating an atmosphere of respectful uncertainty that allows visitors to participate in the mystery rather than simply observe it. The island's economy now depends partly on maintaining the mystery. Solving the puzzle completely might actually reduce tourist interest, creating the peculiar situation where ignorance becomes more valuable than knowledge. It's like having a business model based on not solving the problem you claim to be investigating. A gentle paradox that speaks to the human preference for wonder over certainty. Visitors walk the same shores where colonists once landed, their footsteps mingling with echoes of earlier arrivals and departures. Tour guides speak in hushed, reverent tones about the various theories, their voices carrying the weight of centuries of speculation and hope. Families pose for photographs beside markers that commemorate events that may never have happened exactly as described, but the markers themselves become part of the story, evidence of how deeply the mystery has embedded itself in American consciousness. Gift shops sell replicas of artifacts that might have belonged to the colonists, each purchase a small act of faith in the continuing power of the story to move and inspire. The lost colony has also become a symbol for broader themes in American culture. The risks of exploration, the costs of independence, the tragic consequences of cultural conflicts, and the persistent hope that missing people might somehow have survived against impossible odds, each theme resonating with the deep harmonics of the American experience. These symbolic meanings have given the story staying power that purely historical accounts might not have maintained, transforming a local 16th century disaster into a national meditation on what it means to venture into the unknown. The mystery serves as a screen onto which Americans can project their own concerns about loss, abandonment, and survival in challenging circumstances, finding in the disappeared colonists reflections of their own fears and hopes. The story speaks to the particular American anxiety about leaving home and family behind in pursuit of something better, the way the promise of new opportunities always carries the risk of losing everything familiar and dear. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island might have understood something of what the Roanoke colonists experienced, the mixture of hope and terror that comes with cutting ties to everything known and trusted. The lost colony becomes a founding myth for a nation built by people willing to disappear from their old lives in order to create new ones, even when the outcome remained uncertain. The cultural mythology surrounding the lost colony demonstrates how historical mysteries can become more influential than historical facts, the power of unanswered questions to capture imagination in ways that settled facts never could. The story's emotional power and symbolic resonance have made it an enduring part of American cultural identity, regardless of whether historians ever determine what actually happened to those 117 colonists, their actual fate less important than what their disappearance has come to represent in the collective American imagination. Like constellations that exist more in the human mind than in any physical connection between distant stars, the lost colony story creates meaning through the patterns we perceive rather than through any objective reality we can definitively prove. As you settle into the gentle rhythm of this cultural meditation, you can almost hear the voices of all the storytellers who have kept the lost colony alive in American memory, writers and actors, tour guides and teachers, parents telling bedtime stories to children who will grow up to tell the story again to their own children. The mystery becomes a lullaby that American culture sings to itself, a gentle reminder that some questions are more beautiful than their answers, some disappearances more meaningful than their solutions, some stories more true in their emotional resonance than in their historical accuracy. The lost colony lives on not because we know what happened to those vanished people, but because their disappearance continues to speak to something essential about the American experience, the courage to venture into the unknown, the acceptance that some journeys have no certain destination, and the faith that even when people vanish from the visible world, their stories can continue to offer comfort and inspiration to those who come after, like stars that continue to shine long after. Their light has begun its journey across the vast distances of space and time. You're venturing into the realm of conspiracy theories and fringe speculation that has grown around the Roanoke mystery like kudzu in a Carolina summer. Those wild theories spreading and intertwining until they create an entirely new landscape of possibility, verdant with imagination and heavy with the sweet fragrance of human curiosity. Run wild. When mainstream historical research fails to provide satisfying answers, alternative theories flourish with the enthusiasm of people who've discovered that ancient aliens are responsible for everything from lost socks to traffic jams. Their excitement, as genuine and infectious as children, discovering that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than they ever imagined. These theories range from mildly plausible to completely bonkers, but they all share the common goal of providing definitive answers to questions that have puzzled historians for centuries, like gardeners trying to cultivate certainty in the fertile soil of mystery, each theory blooming with its own peculiar beauty and impossible logic. The landscape of alternative explanations spreads before you like a dreamy garden where ordinary rules don't apply, where cause and effect dance together in patterns that make perfect sense until you try to explain them to someone else. Each theory grows from the same root of human dissatisfaction with uncertainty, branching into elaborate explanations that twist and turn like vines, reaching toward whatever light they can find. In this garden of speculation, Even the most outrageous ideas take on a certain gentle charm, their very impossibility becoming part of their appeal, like flowers that bloom only in fairy tales, but smell real enough when you encounter them in dreams. Some conspiracy theorists propose that the Spanish didn't just attack the colony, but systematically covered up their actions with the help of English authorities who wanted to avoid international conflicts, creating a web of diplomatic deception that stretched across the Atlantic like an invisible net. This theory suggests that both governments knew what happened, but agreed to maintain the mystery to prevent diplomatic complications, their silence as coordinated as dancers moving to unheard music. It's like proposing that two countries collaborated to hide a crime scene, which would require levels of international cooperation that seem optimistic, even by modern standards, let alone 16th century ones, when communication took months and trust between nations was as fragile as morning frost. The theory paints a picture of secret meetings in candlelit chambers, coded messages sent across dangerous waters, and official documents carefully edited to remove any trace of inconvenient truth. The conspiracy as elegant and complex as a clockwork mechanism designed by master craftsmen who have since vanished themselves. Proponents of this diplomatic conspiracy theory imagine shadowy figures in both Spanish and English courts, their faces hidden behind masks of official duty while they carefully orchestrate one of history's most successful cover-ups. They see coded communications in routine diplomatic correspondence, hidden meanings in official proclamations, and deliberate omissions in historical records that speak louder than any confession. The theory transforms boring bureaucratic incompetence into thrilling international intrigue, making the mystery feel less like historical accident and more like masterful planning, the way sunset can transform an ordinary landscape into something magical and mysterious. Time travel theories occasionally surface, usually proposed by people who've watched too much science fiction and not enough History Channel documentaries, their imaginations sparked by the delicious possibility that the past might be as fluid and changeable as water flowing around stones. These suggest that the colonists somehow slipped through temporal anomalies and ended up in different time periods, which would certainly explain why no one could find them in 1590, their absence as complete and mysterious as if they had simply stepped sideways out of their own century. While creative, these theories require accepting that 16th century technology was more advanced than our current understanding of physics, which seems unlikely given that these were people who thought tomatoes were poisonous and that the sun revolved around the earth. Their scientific understanding as charming and limited as children's drawings of how the world works. The time travel theorists paint pictures of colonists stumbling through shimmering portals that opened like doorways in the fabric of reality itself, their wooden tools and simple clothes suddenly out of place in whatever strange when they found themselves inhabiting. Some versions of the theory suggest they traveled backward into prehistoric times, becoming the mysterious ancestors of Native American legends, while others propose they were thrown forward into our own era, living among us as displaced persons from the distant past who have learned to blend into modern society. The theories create gentle fantasies of Elizabethan farmers trying to understand smartphones and automobiles, their wonder at our world as profound as our puzzlement at their disappearance. UFO abduction theories treat the lost colony as early evidence of extraterrestrial contact, proposing that aliens collected the colonists for study or transportation to other worlds. Their spacecraft, descending from the star-filled sky like mechanical angels, come to gather the faithful. These theories point to the complete absence of bodies as evidence that the colonists were removed from Earth entirely, lifted up into vessels that sailed not across earthly oceans, but through the vast spaces between worlds. While this would certainly explain the mystery, it requires believing that aliens traveled across the galaxy, specifically to collect struggling English farmers, which suggests either very specific alien research interests or remarkably poor timing on the extraterrestrials' part. Like cosmic researchers who somehow missed more advanced civilizations and decided that the key to understanding humanity lay in studying people who couldn't figure out how to grow enough food to survive a North Carolina winter. The UFO theorists envision gentle alien visitors, perhaps studying human adaptation to new environments, watching the colonists with the same patient curiosity that we might observe birds building nests in unusual places. They imagined the colonists' final nights on Earth, strange lights appearing over Roanoke Sound, the air humming with frequencies that made the heart race and the mind open to possibilities beyond ordinary understanding. Some versions of the theory suggest the colonists went willingly, recognizing in their alien visitors a form of rescue from their increasingly desperate situation, while others propose a more dramatic abduction, the colonists simply vanishing between one moment and the next, leaving behind only the mystery of their absence and the eternal question of what lies beyond the stars. Secret society theories propose that the colonists were recruited by mysterious organizations that needed people willing to disappear from official records. Their recruitment is carefully orchestrated as a play performed on a stage where the audience never realizes they're watching theater. These theories suggest that the colonists weren't lost, but rather were hidden by groups like the Rosicrucians or early Masonic organizations for purposes that remain unclear. Their disappearance not tragedy, but transformation, not death, but rebirth, into something larger and more mysterious than ordinary colonial life. The main problem with these theories is that they require secret societies to have had recruitment capabilities and logistical resources that seem implausible for the 16th century. Unless ancient fraternities were significantly more efficient than modern ones, their networks of communication and support stretching across continents like invisible webs, spun by master spiders who left no trace of their passing. The secret society theorists imagine robed figures appearing on Roanoke Island under cover of darkness, bearing offers of knowledge and purpose that the struggling colonists couldn't refuse. They see the carved word Croatoan not as a simple message about relocation, but as a coded signal understood only by initiates, its meaning as layered and complex as religious scripture, that reveals different truths to readers at different levels of understanding. These theories transform the colonists from failed farmers into chosen initiates, their disappearance not evidence of disaster, but proof of successful recruitment into mysteries that ordinary history cannot penetrate. Atlantis connection theories link the lost colony to legendary civilizations, suggesting that the colonists discovered remnants of advanced ancient cultures and either joined them or were eliminated to protect their secrets, their fate intertwined with mysteries that stretch back through the mists of prehistory. These theories typically involve underground cities carved from living rock, advanced technology, hidden by previous civilizations who understood sciences we have forgotten, or portals to other dimensions that open like flowers only under specific conditions that the colonists somehow triggered. While imaginative, they require accepting that North Carolina was hiding archaeological wonders that have somehow escaped detection by centuries of subsequent settlement and development, their secrets buried so deep or hidden so cleverly that modern civilization has passed over them like water flowing over submerged stones. These ancient civilization theories paint the colonists as accidental archaeologists, their simple desire to build a new life accidentally awakening forces and knowledge that had slept for millennia. They envision underground chambers filled with crystalline technology, libraries carved in stone that contain the wisdom of ages, and guardians who have waited through centuries for the right people to arrive and carry forward ancient responsibilities. The colonists become not victims but inheritors, their disappearance not loss but graduation into mysteries that transform ordinary human beings into something far more significant and eternal. What's fascinating about these fringe theories isn't their plausibility, but their persistence and popularity. The way they continue to bloom in human imagination like night-blooming flowers that open only when rational daylight fades into the gentler illumination of dream and speculation. They demonstrate how uncomfortable humans are with unsolved mysteries and how willing we are to accept extraordinary explanations rather than live with uncertainty, our minds preferring even impossible answers to the anxiety of questions that remain forever open. The conspiracy theories surrounding Roanoke reveal more about modern psychology than about 16th century colonial failures, showing us the beautiful and sometimes desperate lengths to which human imagination will go in order to transform mystery into meaning, uncertainty into story, and absence into presence. As you drift deeper into the garden of strange theories, you can almost feel the gentle pull of each explanation, the way they offer comfort through certainty, even when that certainty requires believing in things that dance just beyond the edge of possibility. Each theory becomes a lullaby sung by human creativity, a way of transforming the anxiety of not knowing into the satisfaction of elaborate explanation, no matter how unlikely that explanation might be. The theories themselves become as mysterious and beautiful as the original disappearance, proof that human beings would rather live in a universe full of impossible wonders than in one where some questions simply have no answers, where some mysteries remain forever mysterious, where some people vanish without explanation and leave behind only the eternal human need to make sense of things that may, ultimately, make no sense at all, except in the stories we tell ourselves when the night is dark and we need something larger than ordinary reality to help us sleep. You're sitting with serious historians and archaeologists who've spent their careers studying the Roanoke mystery, and their conclusions are far less dramatic than conspiracy theories, but much more grounded in evidence and historical context, their voices carrying the quiet authority that comes from years of patient research and careful thought. These scholars speak in measured tones, their words flowing like gentle streams that have carved deep channels through the landscape of knowledge, each conclusion reached through the slow, methodical process of accumulating evidence and testing. Theories against the stubborn facts of human experience. The scholarly consensus suggests that the colonists most likely made rational decisions based on their desperate circumstances, even if those decisions led to outcomes that seem mysterious from our modern perspective. Their choices as logical and understandable as water flowing downhill, following the natural laws of survival and adaptation. It's like watching people make perfectly logical choices that happen to leave no clear trail for future investigators to follow, their decisions as sensible as footprints on a beach that the tide has since washed smooth and clean. The scholarly voices blend together like a choir of understanding, each researcher adding their own notes to a harmonious conclusion that emerges not from dramatic revelation, but from the patient accumulation of small insights, tiny pieces of evidence that fit together like a puzzle assembled over centuries of careful study. Their conclusions arrive quietly, without fanfare or sensational claims, settling into place with the gentle certainty of truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. These are people who spend their days in archives and laboratories, their nights reading by lamplight, their careers devoted to the slow, careful work of understanding how ordinary people lived and died and made choices in circumstances we can barely imagine. Most historians now believe the colonists abandoned Roanoke Island voluntarily, probably in multiple groups and at different times, seeking better survival opportunities elsewhere, like birds migrating before winter arrives, their movement as natural and necessary as any creature's response to changing conditions. The Croatoan carving likely represents one destination among several, not the final location of all 117 colonists. The word standing like a signpost on a road where many paths diverged into the unknown territories of survival and hope. This theory explains why no mass grave or battlefield has been discovered. The colonists didn't die in one location, but dispersed across the region in search of food, shelter, and safety, their final resting places scattered like seeds carried on the wind to places where they might take root and grow into something new and unexpected. The image of families making difficult decisions in the gathering dusk of their situation carries a quiet poignancy that dramatic theories cannot match. Picture small groups of colonists gathering their few possessions, parents holding whispered conversations about which direction might offer the best chance for their children's survival. Elderly members of the community perhaps choosing to stay behind while younger, stronger individuals ventured into the unknown. The breaking apart would have been gradual, each departure marked by tears and promises to reunite when circumstances improved, farewells that carried the weight of uncertainty about whether such reunions would ever be possible. The integration theory has gained significant support among researchers who study colonial Native American relations, their work revealing patterns of cultural exchange that were far more complex and nuanced than simple stories of conflict and conquest. Archaeological evidence suggests that European materials were incorporated into Native American communities throughout the region during the late 16th century, indicating ongoing contact and cultural exchange rather than conflict and elimination. The blending of cultures as natural and inevitable, as streams converging into larger rivers. Some colonists probably joined friendly Native American groups, intermarried, and gradually became part of indigenous communities in ways that wouldn't leave obvious traces for later investigators. Their transformation so complete and organic that they became invisible to the historical record while remaining very much alive in new forms of community and identity. This integration would have happened slowly, quietly, like seasons changing in the forest, where individual days blend into larger patterns of transformation. Colonist children learning native languages, their English accents gradually softening into new patterns of speech. European farming techniques adapting to native methods that worked better in local conditions. Marriages that created families, bridging two worlds. Their children growing up with stories from both cultures, their identities as complex and beautiful as rivers formed by the joining of multiple streams. The process would have been as natural as any human adaptation to new circumstances, requiring no dramatic events or tragic endings, only the gentle persistence of people learning to live together in ways that honored both survival and dignity. Environmental factors almost certainly played a crucial role in the colonists' decisions. The drought that gripped the region between 1587 and 1589, creating conditions that would have made European-style agriculture nearly impossible, forcing the colonists to either adapt Native American survival techniques or relocate to areas with better resources. The combination of environmental stress and supply shortages created circumstances where abandoning the original settlement was probably the most rational choice available. Their decision to leave as logical as any gardener's choice to move plants from poor soil to richer ground where they might have a better chance to flourish. The drought years would have been particularly difficult for people whose agricultural knowledge was designed for English weather and English soil. Imagine colonists watching their carefully planted fields wither under unfamiliar sun, their European seeds failing to adapt to American conditions, their traditional farming calendar proving useless in a climate that followed different rhythms than the ones they had learned as children. The decision to abandon their settlement wouldn't have come easily or quickly. It would have emerged gradually through many seasons of disappointment and adaptation, each failed harvest making it clearer that their survival depended on learning entirely new ways of living in this new world. Historians emphasize that the colonists' disappearance only seems mysterious because of gaps in documentation, not because their fate was actually inexplicable, the mystery existing more in our modern desire for complete records than in any inherent impossibility of understanding what happened to ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Colonial record-keeping was inconsistent, communication systems were unreliable, and the colonists were trying to survive in an environment where leaving detailed records wasn't a priority. Their energy focused on the immediate challenges of finding food and shelter, rather than on documenting their experiences for future historians. If similar circumstances occurred today, people relocating during a crisis without cell phones or internet, their whereabouts might also become unclear to outside observers, their movements as difficult to trace as footprints in snow that has since melted and refrozen into new patterns. The parallel with modern communication failures helps illuminate the simple humanity of the colonists' situation. In our age of constant connectivity, we sometimes forget how recently in human history people could simply disappear into the vast spaces of the world, their absence noted only by those who knew them personally, their fate remaining unknown, not because of supernatural intervention, but simply because the infrastructure for tracking human movement across great distances didn't exist. The colonists lived in a world where sending a message required months of travel, where relocating even 50 miles could effectively erase someone from the awareness of their former community, where survival often required making choices that couldn't be communicated to distant authorities who might be wondering what had happened. The scholarly approach to the Roanoke mystery focuses on understanding the colonists' decision-making process rather than trying to determine their exact fate, recognizing that the human story is often more important than the specific ending, that understanding why people make choices can be more valuable than knowing exactly what happened to them afterward. Researchers study similar colonial failures, analyze environmental conditions, examine Native American oral traditions, and conduct archaeological investigations to build a picture of what probably happened, even if specific details remain unknown. Their work creating a mosaic of understanding that honors both the complexity of historical truth and the limits of human knowledge. This scholarly patience carries its own beauty, the willingness to live with uncertainty while continuing to seek understanding, to value partial knowledge over dramatic fiction, to find meaning in the process of investigation, even when that process doesn't yield definitive answers. The historians and archaeologists working on the Roanoke mystery demonstrate a kind of intellectual humility that recognizes the difference between what we can know and what we would like to know. Their work proceeding with the steady determination of people who understand that truth emerges gradually, through careful attention to evidence, rather than through sudden revelation or dramatic discovery. What historians find most significant about the lost colony isn't the mystery itself, but what it reveals about early colonial challenges. The way the Roanoke settlement's failure illuminates the gap between colonial ambitions and colonial realities, between the dreams that brought people across the ocean and the harsh practicalities of survival in an unfamiliar world. The Roanoke settlement failed because it was inadequately supplied, poorly planned, and based on unrealistic expectations about survival in an unfamiliar environment. Its collapse as predictable as any other human enterprise that attempted to achieve more than its resources and knowledge could sustain. The colonists' disappearance represents the human cost of colonial ambitions that exceeded practical capabilities, a pattern that would be repeated at other early settlements throughout North America, each failure teaching lessons that future settlers would sometimes learn and sometimes ignore. The broader pattern revealed by scholarly investigation speaks to something universal about human experience, the way our reach often exceeds our grasp, the way hope and ambition can lead us into situations that require more adaptation and resilience than we initially realize we possess. The Roanoke colonists were neither heroes nor villains, neither victims of supernatural forces nor casualties of dramatic conspiracies. They were simply people trying to build new lives under challenging circumstances, making rational decisions based on incomplete information, adapting as best they could to conditions that exceeded their previous experience and preparation. As you settle into the gentle certainty of scholarly understanding, you can almost hear the quiet voices of researchers who have devoted their careers to understanding these long-vanished people, their work creating a kind of memorial that honors the colonists not as mysterious figures, but as recognizable human beings who faced impossible choices with whatever courage and wisdom they could muster. The scholarly consensus offers not dramatic revelation, but something more precious. The recognition that even when specific details remain unknown, the human story itself can be understood, that mystery doesn't require supernatural explanation, that sometimes the most profound truth is simply the acknowledgement that people do their best with whatever circumstances they find themselves facing, and that their efforts deserve to be remembered with compassion rather than sensationalized with speculation. Their disappearance transformed from mystery into understanding, their absence filled not with wild theories, but with the gentle recognition of shared humanity across the centuries that separate our questions from their quiet, unrecorded answers. You're walking along the Carolina shore as twilight settles over the waters, where John White once searched desperately for his missing family, and you can feel the weight of all the questions that have gone unanswered for more than 4 centuries. Their silence as profound and endless as the rhythm of waves against sand that has continued unchanged since before the first European ships appeared on the horizon. The lost colony mystery endures not because it's the greatest puzzle in American history, but because it represents something fundamental about the human experience. Our deep discomfort with stories that have no clear endings, people who vanish without explanation, and mysteries that resist our best efforts to solve them, like trying to hold water in cupped hands or capture moonlight in glass jars, beautiful and impossible, and eternally just beyond our reach. The evening. Light falls across the water like a gentle benediction, transforming the ordinary landscape into something timeless and sacred, the same light that once fell on John White as he called out across these waters for his daughter and granddaughter, his voice carrying hope and desperation in equal measure. You can almost hear the echo of his calls drifting across the centuries, mingling with the cries of seabirds and the whisper of wind through marsh grass, all the sounds of searching and longing that have filled this place since humans first stood on these shores and wondered what lay beyond the visible horizon. There's something particularly haunting about the Roanoke disappearance because it involves ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices for dreams that ultimately failed. Their courage as real and touching as any heroic legend, but ending not in triumph, but in questions that float like mist above still water. These weren't famous explorers or wealthy adventurers, but families with children who crossed an ocean to build new lives in a place that existed more in their hopes than in reality. Their faith as fragile and precious as wildflowers blooming in poor soil, beautiful in their determination to grow despite impossible conditions. Eleanor Dare, giving birth to Virginia, the first English child born in America, represents both the optimism of colonial ventures and the vulnerability of people who staked everything on uncertain outcomes. Her daughter's first cry echoing across waters that held no promise of safety or certainty, only the endless possibility of what might come next. The image of Eleanor holding her newborn daughter carries a tenderness that transcends historical fact, becoming something more like shared memory, the universal experience of parents hoping their children will have better lives than they did, their love strong enough to cross oceans and face unknown dangers. You can almost see Eleanor in those first days after Virginia's birth, holding her child close while gazing across the water toward England, perhaps wondering if her daughter would ever see the country of her ancestors, or if America would become her only homeland. The moment holds all the fragile hope of human endeavor, the way love makes us brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of something better. The mystery has persisted partly because it touches on fears that remain relevant today. The fear of being abandoned, of being forgotten, of making sacrifices that ultimately prove meaningless, anxieties that live in the human heart regardless of century or circumstance. John White's 3-year absence resonates with anyone who's ever worried about letting down people who depend on them. His anguish as immediate and recognizable as any modern parent's guilt over missed opportunities to be present when presence mattered most. The colonists' disappearance speaks to our anxiety about communities that fail despite everyone's best efforts, the way even the most carefully planned endeavors can dissolve like morning mist when conditions change beyond our control or understanding. These are timeless human concerns dressed in historical costume, fears that wear different clothes in different eras, but remain essentially unchanged in their power to haunt our dreams and shape our choices. The parallel between White's situation and modern parental anxiety creates a bridge across time that makes the historical distance feel less significant than the emotional similarity. Every parent who has had to leave a child, every person who has made promises they couldn't keep due to circumstances beyond their control, every individual who has watched helplessly as situations they tried to protect others from spiraled beyond their ability to influence, all can find something of themselves in John White's desperate search for his vanished family, his grief as contemporary as yesterday's tears. What makes the Lost Colony story particularly American is how it embodies both the promise and the peril of starting over in new places, the way it captures both the exhilarating possibility and the terrifying uncertainty that comes with leaving everything familiar behind in pursuit of dreams that may prove as insubstantial as clouds. The colonists represent the optimistic belief that people can create better lives through courage and determination, their faith in new beginnings as characteristically American as apple pie or baseball, but their disappearance reminds us that good intentions don't guarantee success, and that even the bravest ventures can end in ways that leave no trace for history to remember. It's the shadow side of the American dream, the reminder that not every story of reinvention has a happy ending, that the frontier that promises freedom and opportunity also holds dangers that can swallow entire communities without explanation or apology. The American character seems built around this tension between optimism and realism, between the belief that anything is possible and the recognition that many possibilities end in failure. The Lost Colony story speaks to both sides of this duality, honoring the courage required to attempt the impossible, while acknowledging that courage alone isn't always enough to ensure success. The colonists become symbols of every American who has ever taken a leap of faith. Their disappearance a reminder that not all leaps land safely, but that the willingness to jump remains essential to the American spirit. The ongoing search for answers about Roanoke reflects our collective inability to accept that some questions simply can't be answered definitively. Our minds always reaching for closure the way flowers turn towards sunlight, seeking completion and understanding even when the darkness holds no promise of illumination. Historians, archaeologists, genealogists, and amateur investigators continue to search for evidence that might finally solve the mystery, driven by the hope that somewhere in the Carolina soil or in the DNA of modern families lies the key to understanding what happened to those 117 colonists. Their search is as persistent and touching as any lover's quest for a beloved who has vanished without farewell. We keep searching because the alternative, accepting uncertainty, feels like giving up on the people who vanished, abandoning them to a silence that seems too final and too empty to honor their memory or acknowledge their suffering. This persistence in searching speaks to something beautiful about human nature. The way we refuse to let the dead disappear completely, the way love outlasts life and continues seeking answers, even when those answers may no longer exist to be found. Each new theory, each archaeological dig, each genealogical study becomes a form of prayer, a way of saying that these people mattered, that their stories deserve to be known, that their disappearance doesn't diminish their significance in the larger human story. The searches become memorials in their own right, proof that some forms of caring transcend death and time and historical certainty. Perhaps the real significance of the lost colony isn't what happened to the colonists, but what their story reveals about memory, loss, and the stories we tell ourselves about the past. The way certain disappearances become more meaningful than many appearances, certain silences more eloquent than volumes of recorded speech. They've become symbols of all the people throughout history who've made difficult choices, faced impossible circumstances, and disappeared from the historical record without leaving clear explanations for their fates, their absence standing for every unrecorded struggle, every unwitnessed courage, every quiet sacrifice that helped build the world we inhabit without receiving credit or recognition. In searching for the lost colonists, we're also searching for ways to make sense of all the other losses that history doesn't adequately document or explain. The countless individuals whose stories never made it into the official record but whose lives were no less real or important for their historical invisibility. The lost colony becomes a kind of representative for all the forgotten people, all the unsung heroes and unrecorded tragedies that form the true foundation of human civilization. Their mystery stands for every story that was never written down, every life that was lived fully but remembered imperfectly, every person who faced challenges with courage but left no monument to mark their passing. In this sense, the continued fascination with Roanoke becomes a form of democratic remembrance, a way of insisting that ordinary people deserve to be remembered even when their stories resist easy telling. The mystery endures because it represents the gap between what we want to know about the past and what the past is willing to tell us, between our need for closure and history's indifference to our psychological comfort. The way time moves forward, regardless of whether we understand what it has taken with it or left behind. Standing on Roanoke Island today, you can almost hear the echo of unanswered questions carried on the wind from the Atlantic, reminding us that some stories end not with revelation, but with the quiet acceptance that not everything lost can be found. Not every mystery can be solved. Not every disappearance can be explained in ways that satisfy our hunger for understanding and completion. The wind carries more than questions, though. It also carries a kind of peace, the acceptance that comes with recognizing the limits of human knowledge while still honoring the human desire to seek truth and meaning. The mystery of the lost colony becomes less about solving a puzzle and more about learning to live gracefully with uncertainty, to find beauty in questions that have no answers, to appreciate the way some stories become more powerful precisely because they resist conclusion. The colonists' fate may remain unknown, but their story continues to offer something valuable, A reminder that courage is worth honoring even when it doesn't lead to success, that love persists even when its objects vanish, and that some forms of remembrance transcend the need for complete understanding. As the last light fades from the Carolina sky, and you stand where John White once stood, calling across waters that hold their secrets close, you realize that the lost colony mystery offers something more precious than answers. It offers the recognition that uncertainty itself can be a form of beauty, that not every story needs an ending to be meaningful, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because their value lies not in their solution, but in their eternal capacity to remind us of the vast unknowable nature of human experience and the courage required to venture into that unknowing, with hope intact and love undaunted. The waves continue their ancient rhythm, washing the shore clean with each tide, while carrying the memory of all who have stood here wondering, searching, hoping, and finally learning to find peace in the acceptance that some forms of love transcend understanding. Some forms of memory survive the loss of facts, and some stories become most beautiful when they learn to end not with answers, but with the gentle recognition that mystery itself can be a form of grace, a gift that keeps giving long after explanations would have grown stale, and certainty would have diminished the infinite possibility that lives in the space where questions meet the eternal silence of the sea. The evening air grows cooler now, carrying the salt scent of the ocean that once brought hopeful colonists to these shores and later carried John White's ship away from the empty settlement he'd left behind. The wind whispers through the trees that have grown where houses once stood, and the waves continue their eternal rhythm against the beaches where children once played, children whose names we know from passenger lists, but whose fates remain as mysterious as the tide. As you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind drift like those colonial ships across dark waters, carrying you toward dreams where mysteries don't need to be solved to be meaningful, where questions can be beautiful, even without answers, and where the lost colony colonists have found whatever peace eluded them in life. The Atlantic still holds its secrets. The Carolina wind still carries whispers of the past. And somewhere in the space between history and legend, 117 people who dared to dream of new beginnings rest in the quiet certainty that their story, however incomplete, has become part of something larger than themselves. Sleep now, knowing that some mysteries are meant to be felt rather than solved, experienced rather than explained. Tomorrow will bring its own questions and challenges. But tonight, let the gentle rhythm of waves against distant shores carry you into dreams where every story has the ending it needs, even if that ending is simply the peace of letting go.